The year was 1974, and the Smurl family was eager to begin a new chapter in their lives. Jack and Janet Smurl, along with their young daughters, Dawn and Heather, were moving into a quiet neighborhood in West Pittston, Pennsylvania. They were an ordinary family, working class, looking forward to creating a peaceful life together. Their new home, a duplex, was modest but felt like a fresh start. It was the kind of house where Jack could imagine their kids growing up, safe and sound. Little did they know that it would become the setting for a nightmare that would challenge their understanding of reality. The move itself had gone smoothly enough. Jack had just received a promotion at work, and while the extra responsibilities weighed on him, it also meant more financial security for his growing family. Janet, ever the optimist, had already begun mentally decorating their new home. She saw potential in every corner, every wall, every floorboard. Despite its age and the need for some repairs, she felt hopeful. After all, it was a house they could truly make their own. But from the very beginning, the house felt different. At first, it was nothing overtly alarming, just an uneasy feeling that neither Jack nor Janet could quite shake. The air inside the house always seemed cooler than it should have been, especially in the upstairs rooms. There was a certain heaviness in some areas, like the air was denser, harder to breathe. Janet would sometimes feel as though she was being watched, but when she turned around, there was no one there. Then came the sounds. It started with light scratching noises in the walls. Jack, a practical man, assumed it was mice and set about putting down traps, but nothing ever turned up. The scratching persisted. At night, the family would hear soft whispers, faint but unnerving. Sometimes the voices seemed to come from the attic, but when Jack went to check, he found nothing but old insulation and dust. There were no drafts, no wind that could be causing the sounds, and yet the whispers continued. At this point, the family tried to rationalize what was happening. The house was old, so it made sense that there would be creaks and groans. They were still settling in after all. Janet, ever the voice of reason, would reassure herself and the girls that the house was just getting used to them. But deep down, a seed of unease had already been planted. Weeks passed, and the odd occurrences began to escalate. Janet was in the kitchen one afternoon, preparing lunch, when she noticed a dark stain forming on the ceiling above. Her heart sank. Plumbing issues were the last thing they needed. But when Jack came to inspect it, he found that the pipes were fine. The stain, which looked like a deep red blotch, couldn't be explained. Even more disturbingly, it seemed to vanish later that evening, as though it had never been there at all. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, a light bulb exploded in the living room. Glass showered the floor, and the family jumped back in shock. Jack cursed under his breath, muttering something about faulty wiring, but when he replaced the bulb, everything seemed normal again. The next day, though, another bulb blew out in the hallway. This time, Janet noticed that the air had grown cold moments before the explosion, sending a chill down her spine. As the incidents piled up, it became increasingly difficult to dismiss them as mere coincidences. Jack, ever the rational thinker, tried to maintain control of the situation. He busied himself with work, throwing himself into his job to avoid acknowledging the strangeness at home. Janet, on the other hand, began to feel the strain more acutely. She spent more time in the house than anyone else, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to press down on her more and more each day. One particularly unsettling night, as Janet lay in bed beside a sleeping Jack, she heard footsteps in the hallway. They were slow, deliberate, like someone pacing outside their bedroom door. Thinking it was one of the girls, she got up to check. But when she opened the door, the hallway was empty. Her daughters were fast asleep in their rooms, and yet the sound of footsteps continued, echoing faintly as though coming from just out of reach. Fear gripped Janet, but she refused to let it consume her. She told herself it was her imagination, maybe just the house settling. But deep down, She knew something was terribly wrong. She could feel it in her bones. The house wasn't just old. It was something else entirely. And whatever was there, it wasn't friendly. The children, too, began to notice strange things. Dawn, the eldest, mentioned seeing shadows moving in her room at night, though there were no trees or passing cars that could account for them. Heather, still too young to fully understand, complained of bad dreams. She would often wake up crying, saying there was someone in her room watching her. Janet did her best to comfort her daughters, but inside, her anxiety was growing. Jack, still unwilling to fully accept what was happening, brushed off their concerns. He chalked it up to stress from the move, but as the days turned into weeks, even he couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. He would come home from work and find the lights flickering, or a door that had been firmly shut would now be wide open. Still, he insisted that they could handle it, that it was all in their heads. But one night, something happened that shattered Jack's skepticism. As he and Janet were watching television in the living room, a foul, rotten stench filled the air. It was so overpowering that it made them gag. Jack leaped up, convinced there was a dead animal trapped somewhere in the house. But after searching every inch of the room, he found nothing. The smell lingered for hours, then disappeared just as suddenly as it had arrived. From that moment on, Jack could no longer deny that something was terribly, horribly wrong with their new home. The once warm promise of a fresh start had been overshadowed by a creeping darkness, something neither of them could explain but both could feel. The house, which had once represented hope and security, was now a source of fear and uncertainty. And as the days passed, the Smurls began to realize that whatever was happening wasn't going to stop. It was only just beginning. As the chapter closes, the family's unease is palpable. They are trapped between denial and dread, unwilling to admit what they all now suspect. They were not alone in that house. Something unseen and malevolent had taken root, and it was growing stronger with each passing day. This would be the beginning of their long, harrowing battle against an evil they could neither see nor understand. As the weeks turned into months, the small family's sense of unease morphed into outright fear. What had begun as strange sounds and fleeting shadows became impossible to ignore. The malevolent presence in their home was growing stronger, and with it, the intensity of the disturbances. The first sign that things had taken a darker turn came one afternoon when Janet was alone in the house. She had just put Heather down for a nap and was folding laundry in the bedroom when the sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Her heart quickened. Jack wasn't due home from work for hours, and the children were asleep. She tried to stay calm, convincing herself that it was just her mind playing tricks on her. But the sound persisted, growing louder and more deliberate, as though someone or something was pacing just outside her door. With shaky hands, Janet crept to the hallway, half expecting to see one of the girls out of bed. But the hallway was empty, and the air was thick with that now familiar chill. She stood there, frozen, as the footsteps seemed to move through the house. They thudded across the ceiling, down the stairs, and into the kitchen. Janet's breath caught in her throat. There was no explanation for it. It felt as though an invisible intruder was making its way through their home, indifferent to her presence, but undeniably there. When Jack came home later that evening, Janet recounted the events, her voice trembling with fear. But Jack, still clinging to the hope that all of this had a rational explanation, downplayed her concerns. "Old houses make noise," he said, though he knew in his heart that this was no ordinary creak or groan of aging wood. That night, the family was jolted awake by a series of violent bangs. It sounded like someone was slamming doors all throughout the house. Jack leaped out of bed, rushing down the hallway to check on the girls. They were huddled together in Dawn's room, their eyes wide with terror. Dawn insisted that she had seen a dark figure standing at the foot of her bed just moments before the noises began. This time, Jack didn't have an answer. He checked the windows and doors, ensuring they were all locked, but nothing was out of place. The banging had stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Janet stood in the hallway, clutching her robe tightly around her, feeling utterly helpless. Whatever was in their home was no longer content with being subtle. It was making its presence known. As the days passed, the activity in the house grew more physical. Objects began to move on their own. It started small. Janet would find the kitchen chairs out of place or the TV remote on the opposite side of the room. But soon, larger items were being tossed around as though by an invisible force. One afternoon, as Janet was preparing dinner, a heavy cabinet door swung open and slammed shut with such force that it cracked the wood. The noise startled her so badly that she dropped the knife she was holding, cutting her hand in the process. Blood dripped onto the countertop as she stood there, frozen in shock. The children, too, were affected. Dawn and Heather would often wake up in the middle of the night, screaming, insisting they had seen people in their rooms. Dawn spoke of a shadowy figure that seemed to follow her around the house, always just out of sight, but unmistakably there. Heather, barely old enough to understand, became withdrawn, refusing to sleep in her room unless someone was with her. Even during the day, the girls were on edge, jumping at the slightest sound or movement. Jack tried to maintain a sense of control, but the strain was beginning to show. He started staying at work later, desperate to avoid the suffocating atmosphere of their home. But even at the office, he couldn't escape the feeling that something dark had latched onto his family. His co-workers noticed the change in him. His once easygoing demeanor had been replaced by exhaustion and irritability. It wasn't just the physical disturbances that weighed on them. The emotional toll of living in constant fear was taking its toll. Jack and Janet, who had once been a loving and supportive couple, now found themselves snapping at each other over the smallest things. Tension hung thick in the air, not just from the entity that haunted them, but from the cracks it was creating in their marriage. One night, as Jack sat in the living room trying to distract himself with the evening news, the smell returned, the same foul, rotting stench that had overwhelmed them before. It seeped into the room so suddenly and so intensely that he gagged. He rushed to open a window, but the smell clung to him, making the room feel even more suffocating. Janet, who had been upstairs putting the girls to bed, came downstairs with a look of horror on her face. "It's in their room, Jack," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I can feel it. It's watching them." Jack didn't want to believe it, but the fear in her eyes was undeniable. In the days that followed, things only got worse. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, a deep growling sound filled the air, seeming to come from the walls themselves. Jack and Janet froze, the girls crying in terror as the sound grew louder, more menacing. It felt as though the house itself was alive, a malevolent force surrounding them, closing in. For the first time, Jack found himself admitting the unthinkable. There was something in their house, something beyond their understanding. The fear that had been gnawing at him for months was now fully realized. They were not imagining things, and this wasn't some harmless poltergeist. This was something darker, more dangerous. Despite his reluctance, Jack agreed to seek outside help. The tension in their home had become unbearable, and the safety of their children was now at stake. Janet had been begging him for weeks to call anyone who could help. She had heard of people who specialized in these kinds of situations, people who had experience dealing with the supernatural. Though Jack still felt a flicker of doubt, he knew they could no longer handle this alone. The day after the growling incident, Jack reached out to a local priest. He was skeptical at first, but willing to listen to their story. The priest agreed to visit their home, offering to perform a blessing in the hopes of dispelling whatever evil was lurking there. But when he arrived, the house seemed to fight back. The air grew thick and heavy, and the temperature dropped noticeably. The priest, visibly shaken, said prayers and sprinkled holy water throughout the rooms, but it did little to calm the atmosphere. That night, the disturbances grew even worse. As the family huddled together in the living room, the lights flickered wildly, plunging them into darkness. A loud crash came from the kitchen, as though all the dishes had been hurled to the floor. Jack ran to investigate, but found nothing out of place. The house was playing with them, tormenting them in ways that defied logic and reason. Janet could no longer hide the deep sense of dread she felt every waking moment. She had always believed in the goodness of the world, but now, faced with the unrelenting terror in their own home, she was starting to lose hope. The entity seemed to feed on their fear, growing stronger with every passing day. It wasn't just a haunting. It was a slow, deliberate attack on their sanity, their faith, and their family. By the end of the chapter, the Smurls are on the verge of breaking. Jack's skepticism has been shattered, and Janet's resolve is weakening. The paranormal disturbances are no longer random. They are targeted, deliberate, and malicious. The family is trapped in a nightmare they can't escape, and as they stand on the precipice of despair, they know one thing for certain. Whatever is in their house has no intention of leaving. By now, the Smurl family had reached a breaking point. The eerie occurrences that once felt like unsettling background noise to their lives had transformed into a full-fledged assault on their sanity and safety. They could no longer deny what was happening inside their home. Something dark, malicious, and far beyond their control had taken root. With no other options left, Jack and Janet made the difficult decision to seek outside help. They needed answers, and more importantly, they needed a way to reclaim their lives. Janet had heard whispers about a couple who specialized in cases like theirs Ed and Lorraine Warren, well-known paranormal investigators with years of experience. The Warrens had built their reputation by helping families who were dealing with the unexplainable. They weren't just ghost hunters. They were demonologists who had encountered entities far worse than a typical haunting. It was a last-ditch effort, but the Smurls were desperate. They hoped that the Warrens could offer some sort of explanation, or better yet, a solution. The first meeting with Ed and Lorraine Warren was one of cautious hope. The couple arrived at the small residence in the late afternoon, their faces solemn yet kind. They had seen this kind of fear before, the kind that eats away at people's peace of mind, leaving them fragile and unsure. Lorraine, a clairvoyant, could feel the heaviness in the air before she even stepped through the door. She looked at Janet with a mixture of sympathy and concern, knowing full well what might lie ahead. Inside, the house was as cold and unwelcoming as ever. Ed wasted no time in setting up his equipment, audio recorders, infrared cameras, and temperature gauges. He wanted to document every possible sign of the paranormal. Lorraine, on the other hand, walked slowly through the rooms, her eyes half closed as she reached out with her mind, trying to connect with whatever presence lingered there. Her expression darkened as she moved from room to room. "There's something here," Lorraine whispered to Janet as they stood in the hallway, her voice barely audible. "It's not just one spirit. I can feel multiple presences, angry, confused, and something much darker. Much worse." Janet's stomach twisted in knots. She had known, deep down, that it wasn't just her imagination. But hearing it confirmed by someone like Lorraine Warren made it all the more terrifying. Ed approached, his brow furrowed. "We're dealing with more than just a haunting here," he said. "There's a demonic entity in this house, possibly more than one. It's feeding off the fear, off the tension in the family." The words sent a chill down Janet's spine. Demonic. She had feared as much, but hearing it spoken out loud was like a punch to the gut. Demons weren't just ghosts. They were something far more malevolent, something designed to harm and destroy. The Smurls weren't just dealing with a few bumps in the night. They were facing an active threat, one that had already begun to tear at the fabric of their family. The Warrens explained that such entities often latched onto people, not just places. Demons could be drawn to negativity, emotional pain, conflict, or unresolved trauma. Jack and Janet couldn't help but think back to the struggles they had faced in recent years. Jack's difficult job, Janet's bouts of anxiety, the stress of raising young children. Had the house sensed their vulnerabilities and taken advantage? Ed suggested performing a spiritual cleansing of the home. It wouldn't be easy, he warned, and there was no guarantee that it would work right away. Sometimes, these entities fought back when threatened, lashing out even more violently. But the Smurls were willing to try anything. The first cleansing was scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, the Warrens advised the family to stay strong and not to give in to fear. That's what it wants, Ed explained. The more you give into it, the more power it gains. Stand together as a family and don't let it divide you. But standing strong was easier said than done. That very night, after the Warrens had left, the activity in the house reached a new level of terror. Jack and Janet were jolted awake in the middle of the night by a loud crash downstairs. It sounded like furniture had been overturned. Jack rushed to investigate, his heart pounding in his chest. The dining room table had been flipped on its side, chairs strewn across the floor. Yet there was no sign of anyone, no intruder. No open windows, nothing that could explain the mess. As Jack stood there in disbelief, a deep guttural growl echoed through the room. It was low and menacing, vibrating through the walls like an animal stalking its prey. Jack felt a surge of panic, his breath catching in his throat. He had never heard anything like it. He backed away, feeling an icy presence behind him, though when he turned, there was nothing there. Upstairs, Janet was trying to comfort the girls, who had been awakened by the noise. Dawn was sobbing, her voice shaking as she told her mother about the dark figure she had seen standing at the foot of her bed again. Heather was too scared to speak, clutching her blanket as though it were her only protection from the malevolent force lurking in the house. The following day, Ed and Lorraine returned to conduct the cleansing. Armed with holy water, crucifixes, and prayers, they walked through the house, blessing each room, calling on the entity to leave. Lorraine led the spiritual rites, her voice steady but tense. Janet and Jack followed closely, praying silently, hoping against hope that this would be enough to rid their home of the evil presence. At first, the house seemed to resist. The air grew cold, and the smell of sulfur filled the air, an unmistakable sign of something unholy. The lights flickered violently, and a mirror in the hallway shattered as if struck by an invisible force. The house groaned, as though it was alive and angry, but Lorraine pressed on, her prayers louder, more forceful. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the house seemed to settle. The oppressive feeling lifted, if only slightly. For the first time in months, Janet felt like she could breathe again. It wasn't over, she knew that much, but the tension that had been suffocating them had eased, if only for the moment. Ed warned the family that they might not be rid of the entity entirely. Sometimes, these things took time. Demonic forces in particular were known for their persistence. They would retreat, only to return stronger if given the chance. Stay vigilant, Ed told them. This could be just the beginning. For a few days, the house was quiet. Jack and Janet allowed themselves to feel a small flicker of hope. Maybe the worst was behind them. Maybe the blessing had worked. But just as they began to relax, the activity returned this time with a vengeance. It started with the shadows. Janet noticed them first dark, shifting forms that moved just out of the corner of her eye. No matter where she was in the house, she felt like something was watching her, lurking just beyond her vision. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, like a distant conversation, but soon they grew louder, more distinct, until they sounded like voices speaking right next to her. But no matter where she looked, there was no one there. The final straw came one night when Jack was lying in bed, trying to sleep. He felt a pressure on his chest, as though something heavy was sitting on top of him, pinning him down. He tried to move, but his body was frozen, paralyzed by an unseen force. A cold, suffocating presence filled the room, and Jack's heart raced as he struggled to breathe. He tried to call out for Janet, but no sound escaped his lips. Suddenly, the pressure lifted, and Jack gasped for air, sitting up in bed. His body trembled, slick with sweat, and the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. Janet had seen enough. Whatever they were facing was beyond anything they could handle on their own. They needed more help, and they needed it fast. The Warrens, though willing to help, knew that they would need to call in reinforcements. This wasn't just a haunting. It was an all-out battle between good and evil, and the Smurls were caught in the crossfire. The question that loomed over them all was simple, yet terrifying. How much more could they endure before the house and whatever was inside it claimed them for good? The Smurl family was trapped in an unrelenting nightmare. The spiritual cleansing performed by Ed and Lorraine Warren had offered only a brief respite. Now, the dark presence in their home was more aggressive than ever. Each night brought new terror, and even the daylight hours offered no true peace. Jack and Janet were no longer just afraid. They were exhausted, physically and emotionally worn down by the relentless assault on their family. As the days passed, they found themselves locked in a fight for their survival, both against the entity and against the growing strain on their own relationship. After Jack's terrifying encounter with the unseen force in their bedroom, the family knew they could no longer remain passive. They couldn't wait and hope that the activity would subside on its own. It was clear that the entity had no intention of leaving them in peace. Jack, who had once been the skeptic, was now the most determined to take action. He could no longer stand to see his wife and children suffer. He was determined to protect them, no matter the cost. The first step was reaching out to the church again. The priest who had blessed the house previously had been reluctant to acknowledge the possibility of something demonic. But after hearing about the escalation of the events, he agreed to return. This time, he brought with him another priest who specialized in exorcisms. The word alone sent a chill through Janet. The idea that their situation had grown dire enough to require such measures was horrifying. The two priests arrived one afternoon, armed with holy water, crucifixes, and Bibles. They walked through the house with solemn expressions, reciting prayers and sprinkling holy water in every room. Jack and Janet followed behind them, clutching their children close. Lorraine Warren had warned them that an exorcism was not a simple fix. It wasn't like in the movies. There were no dramatic confrontations with the demon where everything would be resolved in a single moment. It was a long, grueling process, and sometimes it didn't work the way people hoped. As the priests moved from room to room, the atmosphere in the house seemed to grow heavier. The temperature dropped, and a sense of unease settled over everyone. The entity was not pleased by their efforts. It was resisting. Janet could feel its presence more acutely than ever. It was as though the very walls were watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. In the middle of the blessing, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. Everyone froze. It sounded as though something heavy had fallen, yet there had been no one upstairs. Jack and one of the priests rushed to investigate, only to find that the bedroom mirror had shattered, glass scattered across the floor. The air in the room was thick with the unmistakable stench of sulfur, a sign that the entity was growing more malevolent. Jack felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he stared at the broken glass. It was a reminder that they were dealing with something far more dangerous than a simple haunting. The priests finished the blessing, but their faces betrayed the doubt they felt. The entity had not been driven out, and had only been angered. Janet's hope, which had already been dwindling, now felt crushed beneath the weight of despair. She could see the exhaustion in Jack's eyes. The toll this battle was taking on him. He was doing everything he could to protect their family, but the strain was becoming too much for him to bear. As the days passed, the entity's attacks became more personal. It wasn't just about fear anymore. it was about control. Jack, in particular, seemed to be targeted. He would hear voices whispering in his ear when no one else was around, telling him that he was powerless, that he couldn't protect his family. Objects would move in his presence, as if taunting him, reminding him that he was up against something far beyond his understanding. He began to lose sleep, plagued by nightmares and a constant sense of dread. Janet watched helplessly as the man she loved slowly unraveled under the pressure. The children were not spared either. Dawn, who had always been the most vocal about seeing shadowy figures in her room, now refused to sleep alone. She was terrified that the entity would come for her, and nothing Jack or Janet said could ease her fear. Heather, who had once been a carefree toddler, was now withdrawn, clinging to her mother's side at all times. The once happy family dynamic had been shattered, replaced by a constant undercurrent of tension and anxiety. One evening, as they sat in the living room trying to distract themselves with a movie, the lights suddenly flickered and went out. The room was plunged into darkness, and the air grew icy cold. Jack jumped up, grabbing a flashlight, but before he could turn it on, a low growling sound filled the room. It was the same sound they had heard before, deep, guttural, and undeniably evil. Janet's heart raced as she clutched Heather to her chest. She could feel the presence in the room, circling them as if toying with them. The growling grew louder, more menacing, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The lights flickered back on, and the room was silent once more. But the sense of dread remained, hanging over them like a dark cloud. Jack was at his breaking point. He had always been the rational one, the man who could fix things with his hands or his mind. But this was something he couldn't control. It was eating away at him, and he knew that if they didn't find a solution soon, it would destroy them. He had to do something, anything, to regain control of his life and his home. That night, as Jack lay awake in bed, unable to sleep, he made a decision. He would fight back. He wouldn't let this entity take everything from him. He began researching ways to defend against demonic forces, reading everything he could find about spiritual protection, exorcisms, and prayer. He reached out to anyone who might be able to help, from religious figures to paranormal experts. He refused to give up, even as the entity continued to wear him down. One of the experts Jack contacted suggested the entity might be using the negative energy in the house to grow stronger. The family's fear, anger, and despair were fueling it, giving it more power. If they wanted to weaken it, they would need to change their approach. Instead of focusing on the fear, they needed to focus on positivity, on love, faith, and unity. It sounded almost impossible, given the circumstances. But Jack and Janet were willing to try anything. They began to make small changes in their daily lives, trying to reclaim their home in any way they could. They prayed together as a family, ate meals together, and spent time doing activities that brought them joy. It wasn't easy. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corner of their eyes, reminded them of the darkness that still lurked in their home. But they were determined not to let it win. Slowly, the atmosphere in the house began to shift. The oppressive feeling of dread that had hung over them for so long began to lift, if only slightly. The entity was still there, still watching, but its power seemed to be weakening. The growling stopped, the violent outbursts became less frequent, and the shadows that had once plagued Dawn's room seemed to retreat. But the fight wasn't over. Jack and Janet knew that they were still vulnerable, and that the entity could strike again at any moment. They had to stay vigilant, to remain strong in the face of the unknown. Their love for each other, their faith, and their determination to protect their children would be their greatest weapons in the battle ahead. By the end of the chapter, the Smurls had begun to reclaim their lives, but the threat of the entity still loomed large. They had learned that the key to survival wasn't just in fighting the darkness. It was in refusing to let it consume them. The Smurl family's ordeal had stretched far beyond what they could have imagined. What began as strange noises and unsettling encounters had spiraled into a nightmare that dominated every part of their lives. They had survived for months, enduring the torment of the dark entity that inhabited their home. Through the help of experts like Ed and Lorraine Warren, priests, and their own resilience, they had managed to hold on. But they knew that the haunting had not ended. The entity, while seemingly weakened, still lingered in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike again. And it was during one of the darkest nights that the final confrontation unfolded. It had been a few weeks since the last major incident, and the family had started to feel a cautious sense of relief. Jack had continued his efforts to keep the negative energy at bay, focusing on family unity and positive reinforcement. Janet, too, had thrown herself into taking care of the girls, finding comfort in the small moments of normalcy they could still cling to. But the entity had merely been lying in wait, its attacks growing less frequent but more intense. That night, the house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, almost tangible, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Janet was upstairs, tucking the girls into bed, while Jack sat downstairs in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV, but not really watching. He was exhausted, physically and mentally, but his mind refused to shut down. There was always that lingering anxiety, that feeling that something could go wrong at any moment. As Janet kissed Dawn and Heather goodnight, she felt a chill sweep through the room. The temperature dropped suddenly, a familiar coldness that sent a wave of dread through her body. She pulled the blankets tighter around the girls, whispering reassurances that she didn't quite believe herself. She told them to sleep tight, that everything would be okay, even though the pit in her stomach told her otherwise. Downstairs, Jack felt it too. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and the air in the room seemed to thicken. His heart rate quickened as he set the remote down, his eyes scanning the room. He couldn't see anything unusual, but he didn't need to. He knew it was back. Before he could call out to Janet, the lights began to flicker. It started softly at first, a faint buzz as the bulbs dimmed, but within seconds, the flickering became violent, the entire room throbbing in harsh, rapid flashes of light and dark. Jack stood up, his instincts kicking in as he moved toward the stairs to get his family. But as soon as he reached the bottom step, a deafening crash echoed through the house. The sound was so loud it felt like the walls were shaking, and it was followed by a deep, guttural growl. The same growl that had haunted them before. "Janet!" Jack shouted, his voice cracking with fear as he bolted up the stairs 2 at a time. Janet had already heard the crash, and she was racing down the hallway toward him, her face pale. "The girls!" she gasped, but Jack grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the bedroom. They had to get the children and leave the house now. But the entity had other plans. Just as Jack reached for the bedroom door, it slammed shut with a force that knocked him back. He stumbled, pulling Janet with him as they both struggled to regain their footing. The door remained closed, though neither of them had touched it. Behind the door, they could hear Dawn and Heather screaming high-pitched, terrified shrieks that made Janet's blood run cold. "Let us in," Janet cried, pounding on the door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard Jack threw his weight against it, it remained locked, held by some invisible force. Suddenly, the lights in the hallway went out, plunging them into darkness. Only the faint glow of the moon through the window illuminated their surroundings, casting long shadows across the floor. The growling returned, louder this time, and it was followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if something was moving toward them from the other end of the hall. Jack's pulse raced. He had never been so scared in his life, but he knew he couldn't give in to fear. The entity thrived on it. He had to stay calm, for Janet, for the girls. Grabbing her hand, he pulled her close, whispering words of reassurance, even though every fiber of his being screamed to run. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, a deep, raspy voice, one that sounded neither human nor animal, echoed through the hallway. It was speaking in a language Jack didn't understand, guttural and harsh, but the intent was clear. The entity was taunting them, asserting its control over the house, over their lives. But Jack wasn't about to let it win. "Get out of our house!" Jack yelled, his voice hoarse with desperation. He grabbed the crucifix from his pocket, the one he had been carrying ever since the Warrens had warned him to keep it close. Holding it high, he began reciting the Lord's Prayer, his voice shaky but determined. Janet, her heart pounding, joined him. She didn't know if it would work, but it was all they had. Together, they stood side by side, their voices rising above the growling, the footsteps, the oppressive darkness that surrounded them. At first, nothing happened. The entity seemed to grow stronger, the air around them growing thicker, suffocating. But Jack refused to stop. He continued to pray, louder now, as if willing the words to push the darkness back. And then, slowly, the growling began to fade. The footsteps ceased, and the air grew lighter. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on them lifted, if only slightly. The door to the girls' room suddenly flew open, and Jack and Janet rushed inside, finding Dawn and Heather huddled together on the bed, shaking and crying but unharmed. Janet scooped them up, holding them tightly, whispering over and over that everything would be okay, even though she wasn't sure it was. The entity wasn't gone. They could still feel it, lurking in the shadows, watching them. But for the first time in months, it had backed down. They had stood their ground, and it had retreated. For the next few weeks, the house remained quiet. The oppressive atmosphere that had once filled every room was lighter, and the family began to breathe a little easier. But they knew they weren't safe, not completely. The entity was still there, waiting for its chance to strike again. Jack and Janet took the girls to stay with relatives while they continued to work with the Warrens and the church to find a permanent solution. They couldn't live in fear forever, and they couldn't allow the entity to destroy their family. They had survived the worst of it, but the fight wasn't over. It never truly would be. For families like the Smurls, haunted by forces beyond human understanding, the battle between light and dark was a constant one. But they had learned something important. No matter how strong the darkness seemed, as long as they stood together, it could never fully win. In the end, the Smurl family had endured what many would consider unimaginable. They had faced an evil that most people never encounter, and they had survived. Their story was one of resilience, of love, and of the unbreakable bond that held them together through even the darkest of times. Fall River, Massachusetts, in the late 19th century, was a city caught between old-world charm and industrial progress. The mills along the Quequane River clattered day and night, providing jobs for many, but also drawing stark contrasts between the wealthy mill owners and the working class. Among the prominent families in this town was the Borden family, who lived in a modest yet respectable home on 2nd Street. Despite their relative wealth, the Bordens were not known for indulgence or extravagance, setting them apart from the other elite families of Fall River. At the head of the household was Andrew Jackson Borden, a stern and frugal man. Known for his rigid demeanor and shrewd business sense, Andrew had amassed a considerable fortune. However, his reluctance to embrace luxury was a point of tension in the household. Instead of residing in the more fashionable hill neighborhood with the wealthiest citizens, Andrew had chosen to remain in the lower part of town, a decision that confounded both his family and his peers. Andrew's 2 daughters, Emma and Lizzie, lived under the same roof but led vastly different lives. Emma, the elder of the two, had assumed the role of the dutiful daughter early in life. Quiet and reserved, She rarely questioned her father's strict ways and seemed content to follow the rules of the household. Lizzie, on the other hand, had a more independent spirit. She was a lively, intelligent young woman who participated in church activities and was involved in the temperance movement. But beneath her social involvement, there was an undercurrent of dissatisfaction, a restlessness that could not be ignored. The Borden family home was not one filled with warmth or joy. Tension simmered beneath the surface, growing stronger with each passing year. Much of this unease stemmed from Lizzie's relationship with her stepmother, Abby Borden. After the death of her biological mother, when Lizzie was just 2 years old, Andrew remarried Abby Durfee Gray, a woman Lizzie never truly accepted as part of the family. To Lizzie, Abby was an intruder, a woman who had taken the place of her beloved mother. This resentment would manifest in small acts of defiance, cold indifference, and open hostility on Lizzie's part. Lizzie refused to address Abby as mother, opting instead for the distant and impersonal Mrs. Borden. Life inside the Borden home was governed by Andrew's strict financial discipline. The family had plenty of money, but Andrew's extreme thriftiness created an environment of austerity. The house had no indoor plumbing, despite their ability to afford such comforts. And the Borden sisters dressed simply, far beneath the standard of their wealthy peers. This frugality extended to everything, from the food they ate to the household staff they employed. The one servant they had, Bridget Sullivan, handled the cooking and cleaning, working long hours for little pay. Bridget, an Irish immigrant, also found herself caught in the strained dynamics of the Borden household. Though outwardly composed, the tension within the family grew heavier by the day. Lizzie's frustrations were palpable, particularly when it came to matters of inheritance. Andrew had recently made significant financial gifts to Abby's relatives, a decision that deeply angered Lizzie and her sister Emma. They felt that Andrew's wealth should be kept within the immediate family, fearing that Abby's relatives would benefit from the fortune they believed should be theirs. The growing distance between Lizzie and her father only added to her sense of isolation. Rumors circulated in town about the Bordens. Some whispered that Lizzie was unhappy, even trapped within her father's rigid world. Others speculated that the household was haunted by more than just familial discord. Neighbors reported odd occurrences around the Borden house, unexplained noises in the night, strange shadows passing by windows, and an air of gloom that seemed to settle over the home. Whether these tales were based in fact or merely fueled by the growing gossip surrounding the family is hard to say, but the Bordens certainly seemed to be a family on the edge. The family dynamic became even more strained in the months leading up to the tragedy that would forever alter their lives. Lizzie, once active in the community, withdrew into herself. She stopped attending church regularly and began spending more time at home, avoiding contact with others. There was an unspoken understanding in the house that things were changing, though no one could predict just how drastic those changes would be. Lizzie's relationship with her father, already strained by years of emotional distance, began to deteriorate further. Though Andrew was not a man prone to outward displays of affection, there had once been a semblance of a father-daughter bond. But by the summer of 1892, that bond had nearly eroded. Lizzie felt trapped in the suffocating confines of the family home, overshadowed by her father's control and the presence of a stepmother she despised. Meanwhile, Andrew remained oblivious to, or perhaps willfully ignorant of, the growing turmoil within his household. His mind was fixed on practical matters, his business, his investments, and his legacy. Little did he know that his family's legacy would soon be defined, not by his financial success, but by a series of events so shocking that they would forever haunt the town of Fall River and turn the Borden name into a symbol of dark mystery. As the summer heat bore down on the town, the tension in the Borden home reached its breaking point. Small disputes escalated into bitter arguments. The air in the house felt thick with unresolved anger, old wounds, and deep-seated resentment. Though no one outside the home could truly understand what was happening behind closed doors, those closest to the family knew that the Bordens were far from the perfect family they appeared to be. By August of that year, the Borden household had become a pressure cooker of emotions, ready to explode at any moment. What began as a quiet unease had transformed into something much darker, something that not even the walls of the house could contain. Fall River, with its bustling mills and gossiping neighbors, was completely unaware that it was about to become the site of one of the most infamous tragedies in American history. For Lizzie, the days felt like a slow, grinding march toward an uncertain future. The tension that had long simmered in her heart was reaching its breaking point. August 4th, 1892, dawned like any other sweltering summer day in Fall River, Massachusetts. The heat was unbearable, pressing down on the town like a suffocating blanket. In the Borden household on 2nd Street, the morning began as uneventfully as any other. Andrew Borden rose early, as was his custom, and prepared to attend to his business matters. Abby, his wife, busied herself with household chores, directing the maid, Bridget Sullivan, to clean the upstairs windows despite the stifling temperature. Lizzie, too, was awake but unusually quiet, her movements around the house subtle, as if she were avoiding the routine interactions that usually defined their mornings. As the clock ticked toward the late morning hours, no one in the Borden home could have imagined how drastically their lives were about to change. What happened next would not only shake the foundations of the Borden family, but also leave a dark stain on the town of Fall River and thrust Lizzie Borden into the spotlight of one of America's most notorious crimes. Abby Borden, the first victim, was upstairs in the guest bedroom, making the bed. According to later reports, she was struck multiple times from behind, a vicious attack that ended her life almost instantly. The sheer violence of the act was shocking. She was struck repeatedly with a sharp instrument, likely a hatchet, with such force that it was clear the person responsible harbored deep, explosive anger. There was no sign of a struggle, suggesting Abby had little to no warning before the first blow landed. While Abby's body lay upstairs, Lizzie was reportedly in and out of the house, engaged in various activities. Some reports suggest she was in the barn looking for fishing supplies, while others claim she may have been in her room. Bridget Sullivan, the family maid, had been asked to clean windows but complained of feeling unwell from the heat. She eventually retreated upstairs to her attic room, unaware of the horror unfolding just a floor below. Andrew Borden returned home around 10:30 a.m. after running some errands. He entered the house through the front door, which Bridget had difficulty opening due to a jam. Once inside, Andrew retired to the sitting room, where he often rested on the sofa. It is believed that within moments of sitting down, he was attacked in a similarly brutal fashion. Like Abby, Andrew was struck multiple times, his face and skull shattered from the blows. The attack was quick, brutal, and merciless. His death was instantaneous. The household, so quiet and routine just hours before, was now the scene of an unimaginable tragedy. Lizzie, by her own account, discovered her father's body around 11 a.m. later, called out to Bridget, who had been resting upstairs, and asked her to come quickly. "Father's been hurt," she reportedly exclaimed. Bridget, still groggy from the heat and fatigue, rushed downstairs and was met with a horrifying sight: Andrew's lifeless body, mutilated beyond recognition. In a panic, Bridget ran to summon help from the neighbors. Word of the killing spread quickly through Fall River, and soon the house was swarming with neighbors, police, and curious onlookers. Lizzie remained strangely calm amid the chaos, while others were hysterical, unable to comprehend the brutality of what had happened. Lizzie appeared composed, answering questions from the police in an oddly detached manner. When asked where she had been at the time of the attacks, Lizzie gave conflicting statements, at one point saying she had been in the barn looking for tools, and another claiming she had been inside the house. As the police began their investigation, it quickly became apparent that something was deeply amiss. Despite the savagery of the murders, there were no clear signs of an intruder. No one had seen a stranger enter or leave the house, and nothing appeared to have been stolen. The only people present at the time of the murders were Lizzie, Bridget, and, of course, the two victims. Suspicion naturally began to fall on Lizzie. Her inconsistent statements, calm demeanor, and apparent lack of grief raised eyebrows. Furthermore, her strained relationship with Abby was well known in the community. It was no secret that Lizzie harbored resentment toward her stepmother, and her attitude toward her father had become increasingly distant in the months leading up to the tragedy. The murders themselves seemed deeply personal. The ferocity of the attacks suggested a level of rage that would be difficult to reconcile with a random intruder. And yet, there was no clear evidence pointing directly to Lizzie. No weapon, no blood-stained clothing, nothing that could definitively prove she had committed the crimes. Nevertheless, rumors spread quickly. Fall River was a small town, and people were quick to talk. The idea that a well-bred woman from a prominent family could be capable of such horrific violence shocked and fascinated the public. Whispers about Lizzie's possible involvement grew louder with each passing day. The investigation into the Borden murders was plagued by missteps from the start. The crime scene was not properly secured, and townspeople wandered in and out of the house, potentially contaminating evidence. The police, unused to dealing with such a high-profile crime, were ill-equipped to handle the investigation. Still, they searched for the murder weapon, questioned everyone in the household, and attempted to piece together what had happened. Lizzie's behavior continued to raise questions. Just days after the murders, she was seen burning a dress in the stove, claiming it had been stained with paint. This act, while not incriminating in itself, fueled suspicions that she was trying to destroy evidence. Additionally, several witnesses reported seeing Lizzie acting strangely in the days leading up to the murders, though no one could pinpoint anything specific. The autopsies on Andrew and Abby Borden revealed the full extent of the violence they had suffered. Both had been struck multiple times with a sharp object, their wounds indicating a brutal, focused attack. The medical examiner also concluded that Abby had been killed first, sometime between 9 o'clock and 10:30 a.m., while Andrew's death occurred shortly after he returned home. The townspeople, already fascinated by the Bordens, now found themselves embroiled in a mystery that seemed almost too shocking to be real. How could such violence erupt in the home of one of Fall River's most respected families? And more importantly, who could have committed such a crime without leaving behind any clear evidence? As the days passed, the investigation intensified. The police, under increasing pressure to find the culprit, began to focus more intently on Lizzie. Her calm exterior, combined with her conflicting accounts and suspicious behavior, made her the prime suspect in the eyes of many. But without solid proof, the case against her remained circumstantial. The town of Fall River, still reeling from the shock of the murders, began to turn its attention toward Lizzie with equal parts suspicion and morbid curiosity. Could this quiet, respectable woman have committed such a horrific act? Or was she, too, a victim of unimaginable circumstances? The truth remained elusive, buried beneath layers of fear, suspicion, and secrecy. And so, as the investigation continued, the mystery deepened, and the Borden household, once simply the residence of a wealthy family, became the epicenter of one of the most notorious unsolved cases in American history. The investigation into the Borden murders took an unexpected turn when Lizzie Borden became the primary suspect. Fall River was a tight-knit town, and the idea of a woman, especially one from a respected family, committing such a brutal crime was difficult for many to accept. However, as details of Lizzie's behavior and inconsistencies in her story began to emerge, suspicion grew. The days following the murders were filled with confusion and speculation. The police initially struggled to gather solid evidence, hampered by their lack of experience with crimes of such a gruesome nature. They searched the Borden house from top to bottom, looking for the murder weapon and any clues that might point to the killer. Although a hatchet was found in the basement, it was clean, and no blood-stained clothing could be directly linked to the crime. Lizzie's actions in the days following the murders did little to ease suspicions. One of the most damning moments came when she was caught burning a dress in the kitchen stove. Lizzie explained to those who questioned her that the dress had been stained with paint and was no longer wearable. But to the authorities, the act raised red flags. Why would she destroy clothing in the middle of a murder investigation? Some believed it was an innocent act, while others saw it as a desperate attempt to cover her tracks. Despite the lack of direct evidence, the police arrested Lizzie Borden on August 11, 1892, a week after the murders. Her calm demeanor during the arrest and her apparent lack of emotion only fueled public curiosity. It was clear that this case was not going to fade quietly into the background Fall River, and soon the nation became captivated by the unfolding drama. Lizzie's trial began on June 5, 1893, and from the outset, it was a spectacle unlike anything the small town of Fall River had ever seen. The courthouse was packed with journalists, townspeople, and those simply eager to witness the proceedings firsthand. The media coverage of the trial turned Lizzie into a national figure, with newspapers across the country reporting every detail, often sensationalizing the story to keep readers engaged. The trial would be remembered for its many dramatic moments, starting with the all-male jury. In 1893, women were not allowed to serve on juries, so it was 12 men who would ultimately decide Lizzie's fate. The defense, led by former Massachusetts Governor George D. Robinson, was determined to paint Lizzie as an upstanding woman of good character, someone incapable of committing such an unspeakable crime. Robinson, along with his co-counsel Andrew Jennings, framed the case around the idea that no woman, least of all a proper, church-going woman like Lizzie, could ever be guilty of such savagery. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Hosea Knowlton, faced an uphill battle from the beginning. With no witnesses to the crime, no murder weapon conclusively linked to Lizzie, and no clear motive, the prosecution relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. They argued that Lizzie's hatred for her stepmother, Abby, and her frustration over her father's tight control of the family fortune gave her reason to commit the murders. However, proving that Lizzie was capable of such an act was another matter entirely. One of the most contentious points of the trial was Lizzie's contradictory statements regarding her whereabouts during the time of the murders. In one version, she claimed to have been in the barn looking for tools. In another, she said she was in the house, unaware of the murders until she discovered her father's body. These inconsistencies, combined with the fact that no one else was seen entering or leaving the house during the crucial hours, cast a shadow of doubt over her innocence. Another key piece of evidence was the broken hatchet found in the Borden basement. Although it was never definitively proven to be the murder weapon, the prosecution argued that it matched the shape of the wounds on Andrew and Abby Borden. Still, without any traces of blood on the weapon or Lizzie's clothing, the connection remained tenuous at best. The prosecution's case also relied heavily on the testimony of Bridget Sullivan, the family's maid. Bridget's account of the morning of the murders was consistent. She had been outside cleaning windows when the attacks occurred, and she claimed to have heard nothing unusual inside the house. Bridget's testimony did little to help the prosecution's case, as she provided no direct evidence that Lizzie was responsible. However, her role in the household dynamic shed light on the tensions within the family, particularly the strained relationship between Lizzie and her stepmother. Despite the prosecution's efforts, the defense effectively dismantled many of their arguments. George Robinson, in particular, delivered powerful closing statements. reminding the jury that there was no physical evidence tying Lizzie to the murders. He questioned how Lizzie, a woman of good reputation, could have committed such a brutal act and then remained so calm in the aftermath. He also played to the societal beliefs of the time, emphasizing that it was unthinkable for a woman of Lizzie's standing to engage in such violence. Lizzie herself did not testify during the trial, which was not uncommon for defendants at the time. However, her silence left many wondering if she had something to hide. Her calm and stoic demeanor in court led some to believe she was capable of committing the crime, while others saw her as a woman wrongfully accused, overwhelmed by the enormity of the situation. The trial lasted nearly 2 weeks, and when the time came for the jury to deliberate, the public waited with bated breath. After just 90 minutes of discussion, the jury returned with their verdict: not guilty. Lizzie Borden was acquitted of all charges, and the courtroom erupted in applause. Her supporters, including her sister Emma, rejoiced, while others were left stunned, unable to comprehend how Lizzie had escaped conviction. Despite her acquittal, Lizzie Borden's life would never return to normal. The town of Fall River remained deeply divided. Many people believed that justice had not been served, convinced that Lizzie had indeed committed the murders, but had been able to escape punishment due to her wealth and social status. Others saw her as a victim of circumstance, unfairly vilified by a society that couldn't reconcile the idea of a woman committing such a crime. Lizzie and her sister Emma inherited their father's estate after the trial, giving them financial security, but the Borden name was forever tainted by the events of that summer. Lizzie, now known as Lizzie Borden, became a figure of fascination, shunned by many in her community, yet celebrated by others for having escaped conviction. She and Emma moved to a new home in Fall River, a large house they named Maplecroft, but they were never able to escape the shadow of the past. In the years that followed, rumors about the murders persisted. Some speculated that Lizzie had acted out of frustration and anger, unable to cope with her father's control and her stepmother's presence in her life. Others suggested that Lizzie might not have acted alone, that someone else, perhaps even Bridget Sullivan, had helped her cover up the crime. These theories, however, remain just that speculation without any definitive proof. The legacy of the Borden murders lived on in American folklore, with nursery rhymes and ghost stories immortalizing the case. Lizzie Borden took an axe, became a part of popular culture, even though no one truly knows whether Lizzie herself ever held the murder weapon. The trial marked a pivotal moment in the history of American crime, not only because of the brutality of the killings, but also because of the way it challenged societal views on gender, class, and violence. For Lizzie, the trial was both a beginning and an end. She was free, but she would never be truly free from the weight of the accusations. Fall River, once her home, had become a place filled with whispers, gossip, and an unshakable sense of unease. As the years passed, the unanswered questions about the murders continued to haunt those who had followed the case. The truth, it seemed, would remain buried, just like the victims of that terrible day in August. Though acquitted of the gruesome murders of her father and stepmother, Lizzie Borden's life after the trial was far from peaceful. The courtroom had declared her not guilty, but public opinion was another matter entirely. The small town of Fall River was divided. For many of Lizzie's neighbors, the verdict did not exonerate her in their eyes. Whispers followed her wherever she went, and despite her freedom, Lizzie would never escape the shadow of suspicion. After the trial, Lizzie and her older sister Emma inherited their father's estate. Andrew Borden had been a wealthy man, and the sisters now had the financial security their father had withheld during his life. With this newfound wealth, Lizzie was determined to leave behind the house on 2nd Street, which had become synonymous with tragedy. The sisters moved to a grander home in the more affluent part of Fall River, a large Queen Anne-style house they called Maplecroft. This new home symbolized their fresh start, a place where Lizzie could try to build a life free from the past. But the past was not so easily escaped. Fall River was a small town, and the gruesome nature of the murders ensured that people would continue to talk. Even though Lizzie and Emma now lived in a wealthier part of town, Lizzie found herself isolated. Her once close friends were reluctant to be seen with her, and many in the community openly shunned her. The stigma of being accused of murder, despite the jury's verdict, was too much for most people to overlook. In an effort to reclaim some semblance of normalcy, Lizzie sought to participate in social events and engage in philanthropy. She was a woman of means, after all, and she saw her wealth as an opportunity to contribute to her community. But despite her efforts, Lizzie's presence was rarely welcomed. At church, once the center of her social life, she found herself ostracized. She had always been an active member of the congregation, but now many avoided her, unwilling to associate with someone they still viewed as guilty. Lizzie's strained relationship with her sister Emma began to worsen after the trial. Although Emma had been supportive throughout the legal proceedings, standing by Lizzie's side as she faced the accusations, the tension between them grew in the years that followed. The sisters were fundamentally different in temperament. Emma was reserved and conservative, while Lizzie was more independent and assertive. Their differences were exacerbated by the public scrutiny and the lingering rumors that clouded their lives. It wasn't just the murder accusations that created distance between the sisters. Lizzie, now living under her own financial independence, began to embrace a lifestyle that Emma did not approve of. Lizzie's friendships with women considered outsiders in Fall River, particularly actresses and bohemian figures, further alienated her from the town's conservative social circles and from Emma. Lizzie's desire to live more freely, unburdened by societal expectations, clashed with Emma's desire for a quiet, traditional life. By 1905, tensions between the sisters reached a breaking point, and Emma moved out of Maplecroft, leaving Lizzie to live alone. The exact cause of the rift has never been fully explained, though many speculated that it stemmed from Lizzie's growing friendship with a woman named Nance O'Neill, a well-known actress with whom Lizzie was rumored to have developed a close and controversial relationship. Emma, disapproving of Nance and the lifestyle Lizzie seemed to be embracing, decided she could no longer live with her sister. Emma moved to Newmarket, New Hampshire, and the sisters, once inseparable, never spoke again. Lizzie's friendship with Nance O'Neill was one of the few bright spots in her post-trial life. Nance was everything Lizzie admired: bold, artistic, and free from the rigid expectations of society. Their friendship drew considerable attention and gossip, with many speculating about the nature of their relationship. While the full extent of their connection remains unknown, what is clear is that Nance provided Lizzie with companionship at a time when she was shunned by most others. Lizzie attended many of Nance's performances, often hosting elaborate dinners and parties in her honor at Maplecroft. The friendship scandalized the people of Fall River, further alienating Lizzie from the town's upper class. Despite her efforts to live life on her own terms, Lizzie continued to face public scorn. She was no longer just the woman acquitted of murder. She was a figure of mystery and suspicion, someone who lived outside the boundaries of what society deemed acceptable for a woman of her background. The media, too, never let her forget her past. Tabloid newspapers occasionally ran stories about the Borden case, reigniting public interest and ensuring Lizzie's name remained synonymous with the gruesome murders of 1892. Lizzie's life became increasingly reclusive. She had few visitors and even fewer people with whom she could confide. The large house on the hill, meant to be a symbol of her new beginning, became a place of solitude. Despite her wealth, Lizzie was often lonely, haunted not only by the lingering accusations, but also by the strained relationship she had with those closest to her. She no longer had the companionship of her sister, and even her bond with Nance O'Neill eventually faded as Nance moved on with her acting career. In her later years, Lizzie's health began to decline. She suffered from various ailments, including gallbladder disease, which worsened as she grew older. By the 1920s, she was a frail woman, far removed from the confident, assertive figure she had once been. She lived quietly in Maplecroft, rarely venturing out, and had little contact with the world beyond the walls of her grand home. Lizzie Borden died on June 1, 1927, at the age of 66, after a long battle with pneumonia. She passed away alone, with only a few loyal servants by her side. Despite her acquittal, Lizzie Borden remained an enigma throughout her life. To this day, questions about her involvement in the murders persist. Some believe she was truly innocent, the victim of a flawed investigation and societal biases. Others are convinced she was guilty, having escaped justice due to a lack of conclusive evidence. Regardless of where one stands on her guilt or innocence, Lizzie Borden's life after the trial was marked by isolation, loneliness, and a struggle to find peace in a world that refused to let her forget her past. When Lizzie died, she left behind a substantial estate. She was buried in the family plot in Oak Grove Cemetery, not far from where her father and stepmother were laid to rest. Lizzie, the woman who had once been at the center of one of the most infamous murder trials in American history, found her final resting place in the town that had both condemned and acquitted her. In the years following her death, the story of Lizzie Borden has continued to captivate the public. Her life, her trial, and the unsolved mystery of the Borden murders have become the stuff of legend. Songs, plays, books, and even films have kept her story alive, ensuring that Lizzie Borden will forever be remembered, not just as a figure in Fall River's history, but as a lasting icon of true crime and mystery. Lizzie Borden's legacy, much like the events of that August morning in 1892, remains complex and unresolved. Whether seen as a tragic figure, unfairly maligned by society, or as a calculating woman who evaded justice, Liz's story continues to be a source of fascination, inviting endless speculation and debate. Even in death, she has remained a symbol of one of America's most enduring mysteries. As the years passed and the dust settled on the trial of Lizzie Borden, her story transformed from a courtroom drama into an enduring legend. Even though she was acquitted, the mystery surrounding the brutal murders of Andrew and Abby Borden continued to captivate the public's imagination. For many, Lizzie became more than just a woman embroiled in a scandalous trial. She became a symbol of an unsolved mystery that blurred the lines between guilt and innocence, truth and rumor. The town of Fall River, despite its efforts to move on, could never truly escape the shadow of the Borden murders. For some residents, the case was a reminder of how justice could be swayed by social status and wealth. For others, it was a cautionary tale about the dangers of suspicion and gossip. No matter where people stood, the Borden house on 2nd Street remained a landmark, forever tied to the grisly events of that fateful August morning. The media's fascination with the Lizzie Borden case never waned. In the years immediately following the trial, newspapers continued to publish speculative articles, often revisiting the details of the crime, rehashing old evidence, and proposing new theories. Some journalists interviewed people who had lived in Fall River at the time, hoping to uncover fresh insights. However, as time wore on, the facts of the case became entangled with myth and rumor, making it increasingly difficult to separate truth from fiction. By the early 20th century, Lizzie Borden's story had taken on a life of its own, evolving into a piece of American folklore. The infamous children's rhyme, "Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks," became a widely known chant. Though it was wildly inaccurate, Abby Borden had been struck 19 times, and Andrew 11. Still, the rhyme captured the public's macabre fascination with the case and cemented Lizzie's place in the collective consciousness. Despite Lizzie's death in 1927, the story of the Borden murders lived on. Writers, filmmakers, and playwrights found inspiration in the case, using it as the basis for countless retellings and adaptations. Novels, short stories, and plays kept the tale alive, often portraying Lizzie as either a cold-blooded killer or an innocent woman wronged by society. Each retelling added new layers to the legend, sometimes playing fast and loose with the facts to create a more dramatic narrative. As the true crime genre gained popularity in the 20th century, Lizzie Borden became one of its most famous figures. Her trial, with its shocking violence and lack of resolution, was tailor-made for the growing appetite for crime stories. Writers and filmmakers were drawn to the ambiguity of her case. The question of whether Lizzie was truly innocent or guilty had never been definitively answered, making it a compelling mystery that could be revisited time and time again. In the 1960s and 70s, as interest in true crime continued to grow, Lizzie's story was re-examined by a new generation of writers and historians. Books such as Edmund Pearson's Trial of Lizzie Borden and Arnold Brown's Lizzie Borden, The Legend, The Truth, The Final Chapter, sought to uncover new evidence and provide fresh perspectives on the case. However, despite their efforts, the mystery remained as elusive as ever. With no clear motive, no conclusive forensic evidence, and no eyewitnesses, the case defied simple explanation. Television and film also contributed to the enduring legacy of Lizzie Borden. In the 1970s, Elizabeth Montgomery starred in the made-for-TV movie The Legend of Lizzie Borden, portraying Lizzie as a woman who may have been pushed to her limits by family tensions and societal pressures. The film was a hit, and it introduced the Borden case to a new audience, sparking renewed interest in the story. In the years that followed, documentaries and TV specials frequently revisited the Borden murders, each trying to offer a definitive answer to the age-old question. Did Lizzie do it? The case became a favorite topic for paranormal shows as well, with some claiming that the Borden house was haunted by the restless spirits of Andrew and Abby. Ghost hunters and paranormal enthusiasts descended on Fall River, eager to experience the eerie atmosphere of the house where the murders took place. The Borden family home at 92 2nd Street, where the murders took place, eventually became one of the most infamous haunted houses in the United States. Over the years, the house changed ownership several times, but its dark history remained a draw for curious visitors. In the 1990s, the house was converted into a bed and breakfast, offering guests the unique and somewhat unsettling opportunity to stay in the very rooms where the murders occurred. The Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast Museum became a popular tourist attraction, with visitors coming from all over the country to tour the house and learn about the crime that shocked the nation. Guests could sleep in the bedroom where Abby Borden was killed, or sit on the couch where Andrew Borden's life was violently ended. For some, it was a chance to experience a piece of history up close. For others, it was a way to indulge their fascination with true crime and the paranormal. The owners of the bed and breakfast embraced the house's eerie reputation, offering ghost tours and encouraging visitors to share their supernatural experiences. Many claimed to have heard strange noises, seen mysterious shadows, or felt an inexplicable presence while staying in the house. Whether or not these experiences were real, they added to the mystique of the Borden murders and ensured that the legend of Lizzie Borden would continue to thrive. More than a century after the murders, Lizzie Borden remains an enduring figure in American history. Her case has been analyzed, debated, and reinterpreted countless times, yet it continues to resist a definitive conclusion. Was Lizzie a victim of circumstance, wrongly accused of a crime she didn't commit? Or was she a calculating murderer who managed to evade justice? These questions have never been answered to everyone's satisfaction, and perhaps they never will be. The enduring fascination with Lizzie Borden speaks to the complexities of her case. At the heart of the story is a young woman who, in the eyes of society, defied the expectations placed upon her. In a time when women were expected to be dutiful daughters and devoted homemakers, Lizzie stood out as a figure of independence and defiance. Whether that defiance manifested in murder or in her refusal to conform to societal norms remains the subject of debate. Lizzie's legacy also highlights the changing nature of crime and punishment in America. Her trial took place at a time when forensic science was in its infancy, and the lack of concrete evidence in her case serves as a reminder of how far criminal investigations have come since the late 19th century. If the Borden murders had occurred in modern times, with today's advancements in DNA analysis and forensic techniques, the outcome might have been very different. As new generations discover the story of Lizzie Borden, her place in popular culture continues to evolve. She has been the subject of countless books, movies, TV shows, and even podcasts, each offering a new interpretation of her life and the infamous murders. For some, Lizzie is a misunderstood woman who is unfairly targeted by a biased society. For others, she remains a chilling reminder of how easily violence can erupt in even the most ordinary of households. In the end, the story of Lizzie Borden is one that refuses to fade into history. Her life, her trial, and the mystery that surrounds her have become a permanent part of American folklore. Whether viewed as a villain or a victim, Lizzie's name will forever be synonymous with one of the country's most infamous unsolved murders. And as long as there are unanswered questions, the legend of Lizzie Borden will continue to haunt the public imagination, just as it has for over a century. The Bell family lived a quiet and peaceful life in the rural countryside of Adams, Tennessee, in the early 19th century. John Bell, the patriarch, was a well-respected farmer who had moved to the area with his wife, Lucy, and their children, hoping to build a prosperous and serene life. Their farmhouse, nestled among sprawling fields and towering trees, seemed like the perfect place to raise a family. Little did they know, something far darker lurked beneath the calm surface of their lives. It was in 1817 when strange things began to occur on the Bell property. At first, the signs were subtle and easy to dismiss. John would occasionally see odd animals wandering near the edges of his fields, creatures he couldn't quite identify, their forms shifting and unnatural. He spotted what looked like a large dog with a rabbit's head, and another time, a bird too large for the region perched in a tree. These sightings left him uneasy, but he chalked them up to tricks of the mind, refusing to believe anything was truly wrong. Soon, however, the strange events escalated beyond harmless wildlife. The first real sign of trouble came when John Bell began hearing odd sounds around the farmhouse. At night, the walls creaked and groaned in ways that didn't seem natural, like the wood itself was trying to speak. The noise of knocking echoed through the rooms, and sometimes it seemed like chains were being dragged across the floor, though nothing was ever found out of place. It wasn't long before the rest of the family began to notice these sounds as well. The Bell children, especially young Betsy, started waking up terrified, claiming they heard faint whispering in their ears while they slept. Lucy Bell, though skeptical at first, could no longer deny that something was very wrong when she too began hearing unexplained sounds, as though someone or something was watching them from just beyond their sight. One evening, as the family sat around their dinner table, a loud, sharp knock came from the front door. John, thinking it might be a late visitor or a neighbor in need, got up to answer it, only to find no one there. The knock came again, this time from the back door. But once again, there was no one in sight. The third knock came from inside the house itself. The family sat frozen in fear, unable to explain how this could be happening. They had begun to realize that something far more sinister than a prank was at play. Over the next few days, the haunting sounds grew louder and more frequent. It was as though the house had come alive with a presence that couldn't be seen, but was undeniably there. The walls echoed with strange voices, doors creaked open and shut on their own, and footsteps could be heard pacing through empty rooms. Yet, whenever the family tried to investigate, they found nothing. It was as though an invisible force had taken up residence in their home, and it wasn't going to leave anytime soon. John Bell, being a man of faith and reason, sought to keep his family calm, reassuring them that there had to be a logical explanation. Perhaps it was the wind or some natural phenomena, but deep down, he knew better. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and no amount of reason could explain away the growing terror they felt each night. Despite his outward calm, he couldn't shake the creeping fear that this presence had come for him. Specifically, the once tranquil Bell home had become a place of dread. No longer able to ignore the strange happenings, John confided in a close neighbor, seeking advice on what to do. But the neighbor had no solutions. Word began to spread in the small community that the Bell family was experiencing something otherworldly, though few believed it at first. After all, who would believe that a house could be haunted by something invisible, something so relentless and violent? The days passed, but the entity showed no sign of leaving. The family could no longer sleep through the night, as the knocking, the scratching sounds, and the heavy footsteps never ceased. It was as if the entity wanted them to know it was always there, lurking just beyond the edge of their understanding, waiting for something darker yet to come. As the weeks wore on, the Bell family found themselves slipping into a state of constant fear and exhaustion. They had no idea what the entity wanted, but they knew it wasn't going to leave on its own. Whatever this presence was, it had taken root in their home, and they were helpless to stop it. The Bell Witch had arrived, and the nightmare was only beginning. As the days turned into weeks, the Bell family's quiet farmhouse became a place of escalating fear and confusion. What had begun as strange noises and eerie disturbances quickly transformed into something far more aggressive. It seemed the entity, whatever it was growing stronger. No longer content with simply haunting the house, it began to physically target the family, with a particular focus on John Bell and his young daughter, Betsy. The first signs of the entity's more dangerous nature emerged when Betsy started to experience strange sensations at night. At first, it felt like gentle taps on her skin, like someone lightly flicking her arm. She tried to ignore it, thinking it was nothing more than her imagination. But soon, these sensations grew into something much more alarming. She would wake up in the middle of the night to the feeling of her hair being yanked, her bed covers ripped off, or an invisible hand slapping her face. These attacks left her terrified and helpless, but they were just the beginning. As Betsy's torment grew, so did the malevolent presence in the house. Objects that once sat quietly on shelves would now fly across the room without warning, smashing into walls or crashing to the floor. Chairs would tip over by themselves, and dishes would shatter for no apparent reason. The invisible force seemed to revel in causing chaos, as if it found joy in making the Bell family live in constant fear. John Bell, too, was not spared from the entity's wrath. One morning, as he was working in the fields, he felt a sudden sharp pain in his face, as though he had been struck by an unseen hand. He stumbled, clutching his cheek, but when he looked around, there was no one there. This mysterious attack repeated itself several times over the coming weeks. John would be walking through his home or tending to his land when, without warning, he would feel the sting of an invisible force hitting him. Sometimes it was a slap, other times a violent push that nearly knocked him off his feet. The relentless torment began to take its toll on the entire family. Betsy, once a bright and lively girl, became withdrawn and fearful. She spent her days in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing when the next attack would come. Her schoolwork suffered, and she became too frightened to sleep alone at night, often seeking comfort in her parents' room. The stress weighed heavily on John and Lucy Bell as well. as they watched their daughter suffer and felt powerless to stop it. Despite their growing desperation, the Bell family tried to maintain some sense of normalcy. They continued their daily routines, farming, cooking, and tending to the household, hoping that by ignoring the entity, it might go away. But the more they ignored it, the more aggressive it seemed to become. The Bell children, especially Betsy, were often targeted while they slept. On one particularly terrifying night, Betsy awoke to find herself being lifted from her bed by an unseen force. She screamed in terror, and her parents rushed to her room, only to find her suspended in midair, her body thrashing as if being held by an invisible grip. As soon as John and Lucy entered the room, Betsy was dropped back onto her bed, gasping for breath and trembling with fear. There was no explanation for what had just happened, no way to rationalize the nightmare their daughter was living through. The attacks didn't stop with Betsy. Other members of the household also began experiencing physical assaults. Knocks and slaps came out of nowhere, leaving bruises and welts on their skin. The Bell family soon realized that they were dealing with a force beyond their understanding, one that was not only malicious, but intelligent. It seemed to know exactly when and how to strike, always leaving them on edge, waiting for the next act of violence. Word of the Bell family's plight began to spread throughout the community. Neighbors who visited the house witnessed the strange occurrences for themselves, objects moving on their own, doors slamming shut, and the eerie sounds of whispering voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Some locals believed the family had fallen victim to a powerful curse, while others thought they were dealing with an angry spirit seeking revenge for some past wrong. As the entity's attacks grew more frequent and more violent, the family became desperate for answers. John Bell turned to friends and neighbors for help, hoping that someone might know how to rid their home of the invisible force. But no one had any solutions. Ministers and pastors were called in to pray over the house, but even their spiritual guidance couldn't stop the torment. The Bell family began to lose hope, feeling as though they were trapped in a nightmare with no way out. The Bell Witch, as the entity had now come to be called, was relentless. It seemed to feed off the family's fear and suffering, growing more powerful with each passing day. John Bell, in particular, seemed to be the primary target. His health began to deteriorate as the constant stress and fear took a toll on his body. His once strong frame became frail, and his hands shook with anxiety. It was clear that the entity wanted something, but what it wanted remained a mystery. Despite the family's efforts to resist, they were losing their battle against the unseen force. The Bell Witch had made its intentions clear. It wasn't going to leave until it had finished whatever dark mission it had come to carry out. And as the attacks on Betsy and John grew more intense, the family couldn't help but wonder if they would survive the ordeal. The torment had already reached unbearable heights for the Bell family, but they were about to discover that the entity haunting their home was far more terrifying than they ever imagined. What had begun as an invisible, violent presence soon revealed itself to be something that could speak, something that could communicate with chilling clarity. It wasn't just a ghost or some mindless force. It was intelligent, cunning, and it had a voice. The first time the entity spoke, it caught the family completely off guard. They had grown used to the eerie knocks, disembodied footsteps, and the unsettling physical attacks. But when the family was sitting quietly one evening, bracing themselves for whatever might come next, a voice filled the room cold, clear, and unmistakably human. It came from nowhere and everywhere all at once, as if the very walls of the house were speaking. "I am here for John Bell," the voice said plainly. The family froze, staring at one another in disbelief. Was this some kind of cruel trick? But no, they all heard it. John Bell's face drained of color. Whatever this thing was, it had just declared that it was targeting him specifically. The air in the room seemed to thicken with dread as the voice continued, sometimes mocking, sometimes angry, but always clear in its hatred for John. The entity called itself Kate, though it later became widely known as the Bell Witch, and it made no secret of its intentions. The voice was unlike anything they had ever experienced before. It wasn't just random murmurs or whispers. It spoke in full sentences, as if it were a living person. It would ask questions, make demands, and even hold conversations with the family and their visitors. What made it even more terrifying was its depth of knowledge. Kate seemed to know things about the Bell family and their neighbors, secrets, events, and details that no one outside the family could have known. It could describe what was happening in other parts of town as if it had been there itself, watching and listening. The voice also seemed to enjoy tormenting Betsy. It would call her name in the dead of night, whisper cruel things in her ear, and laugh whenever she cried out in fear. It wasn't just content with physical attacks anymore. It wanted to break her spirit, to make her feel hopeless and afraid. The once bright and happy child was now a shadow of herself, living in constant fear of when the voice would speak again, what it would say, and what it would do. John Bell was another favorite target of the witch. Kate often berated him, insulting him, and claiming that it had come to end his life. It was as though the entity had a personal vendetta against him. The reasons were never entirely clear, though rumors swirled that Kate Batts, a neighbor with whom John had a falling out over a land deal, had cursed the Bell family out of spite. Whether or not this was true didn't seem to matter. The entity that called itself Kate seemed determined to fulfill its promise. The Bell family's friends and neighbors were initially skeptical of their claims about a talking spirit. But that changed quickly when word spread of the strange occurrences, and people began visiting the Bell household themselves to hear the voice. Ministers, curious locals, and even travelers from neighboring counties came to witness the phenomenon, and none left without being thoroughly shaken by what they experienced. The witch, it seemed, enjoyed the attention, often showing off its knowledge of distant events or entertaining visitors by speaking in different voices and tones. It could imitate the voice of anyone it chose. Sometimes it would even mimic the voices of the family themselves, causing confusion and fear. As the entity continued to speak, it became clear that this was more than just a haunting. It was something far more dangerous. The witch took pleasure in manipulating those around it, bending their will through fear, and taunting them with its knowledge and power. The Bell family tried to get help from local ministers, hoping that religious intervention might drive the entity away, but nothing worked. The prayers, the exorcisms, the blessings on the house, none of it made any difference. The voice persisted, as powerful and menacing as ever. And with each passing day, the witch's focus on John Bell grew more intense. It would mock him relentlessly, whispering threats and insults while he went about his daily life. His health, already fragile from the stress of living under such torment, began to deteriorate further. He would wake up in the middle of the night to find himself unable to move, his limbs heavy as though held down by an invisible force. He started suffering from unexplained seizures, his once strong and commanding presence reduced to that of a sickly and terrified man. Despite the terror it inflicted, the Bell Witch's voice wasn't always violent. It had moments of disturbing calm where it would engage in conversations, sometimes even laughing and joking with visitors. It seemed to enjoy playing with people's emotions, luring them into a false sense of security before turning on them with renewed ferocity. The voice was always unpredictable. One moment, it would be soft and friendly, and the next it would erupt in anger, hurling insults or making sinister threats. The most chilling aspect of the witch's communication was its promise. It had come to take John Bell's life, and it wouldn't stop until it had succeeded. The family was trapped in their own home, with no means of escape from the torment that had invaded every corner of their lives. Each day brought them closer to the grim reality that the witch might indeed be able to carry out its threat. By now, The Bell Witch was not just a local legend, but a phenomenon that had captured the attention of people far and wide. Visitors continued to flock to the Bell Farm, seeking answers or hoping to experience the haunting for themselves. But for John Bell and his family, this was no spectacle. It was a living nightmare, and they were all too aware that the witch's promises were not idle threats. The Bell family had now come to understand the true nature of the entity they were dealing with. It wasn't just haunting them, it was targeting them, manipulating them, and working toward a single, terrifying goal. And as John Bell's health worsened, the family could only wait in dread, knowing that the worst was yet to come. As the witch's torment grew more relentless, it became clear that John Bell's days were numbered. The entity that had come to be known as the Bell Witch had made its intentions known from the start. It was determined to take John Bell's life, and now it seemed ready to fulfill that dark promise. Despite the Bell family's efforts to protect him, John's health was rapidly deteriorating, and there was little they could do to stop it. By late 1820, John had become a shadow of his former self. Once a strong and respected farmer, he was now a frail, weak man who could barely leave his bed. The constant stress and fear had taken a toll on him both physically and mentally, and the witch seemed to take delight in watching him waste away. His hands shook uncontrollably, and he struggled to speak or even move at times. The witch's attacks had become more personal, more direct, and more vicious as the weeks wore on. Each day brought new torments. The witch, with its unnerving voice, would whisper cruel taunts in John's ear, reminding him of its power over him. "Your time is near, John Bell," it would say, filling the room with a dark, ominous energy. Sometimes the voice would mock his weakness, laughing at his failing body, while other times it would grow angry. One evening, threatened as the Bell family gathered in John's room, the witch's presence, the family could only watch in horror as John's condition worsened, thick and suffocating. John lay motionless, his breathing shallow and labored. He had been bedridden for days, and the once vibrant man was now barely recognizable. The room was tense with dread as the witch's voice filled the space again, speaking in low, menacing tones. It declared once more that it had come to end John's life, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The following morning, on December 20th, 1820, John Bell did not wake. Lucy, his wife, was the first to find him lying still in his bed. His breathing had become so faint that, at first, it seemed like he might still be alive. But as she approached, it became clear that he was slipping away. She called for the children, and soon the entire family gathered by John's side, praying for a miracle that would never come. In the midst of their grief, the witch's voice rang out again, cold and triumphant. "I did it. I finished what I came to do." The words hung heavy in the air, and the family was left in stunned silence. The witch had claimed responsibility for John Bell's death, just as it had promised it would. There was no mistaking it now. The entity had carried out its grim mission. The cause of John's sudden decline and death had remained a mystery, but in the days following his passing, the family discovered something chilling. Among John's medicine bottles, they found one that contained a strange, unidentified liquid. No one in the family recognized it, and it hadn't been prescribed by the doctor. Desperate for answers, they tested the substance by giving a small amount to the family's cat. Tragically, the animal didn't survive for long after consuming the liquid, confirming the family's worst fears. This mysterious substance had likely been used to poison John Bell. When confronted with this discovery, the witch's voice erupted in gleeful laughter. "I gave him that potion," it proclaimed, reveling in its victory. There was no longer any doubt that the Bell Witch had been responsible for John's death, using the strange liquid to carry out its fatal plan. It was a devastating realization for the Bell family, who had fought so hard to protect John, only to lose him to the very force they had feared for so long. As the Bell family prepared for John's funeral, the witch continued its disturbing behavior. During the solemn event, While friends and neighbors gathered to pay their respects, the entity made its presence known in a horrifying display. The witch's voice interrupted the proceedings, mocking the mourners, laughing loudly, and making crude jokes at the expense of the grieving family. It was a final, cruel insult, adding a layer of humiliation to the pain and sorrow of John Bell's passing. The family was left devastated, unable to escape the reach of the entity, even in their time of mourning. The death of John Bell marked the culmination of the witch's campaign of terror. For years, the Bell family had endured unimaginable horrors, but now the entity had accomplished what it had set out to do from the very beginning. It had taken John's life, and it had done so with a sense of satisfaction and malicious pride. The family was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, unsure of what would happen next. Yet, as dark as things had become, the witch's influence over the Bell household began to wane after John's death. The violent attacks on Betsy grew less frequent, and the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the farm seemed to lift, if only slightly. The entity, it seemed, had fulfilled its purpose, and with John gone, its presence started to fade. Despite the diminishing torment, the Bell family could never truly move on from what had happened. The memory of John's suffering and the witch's cruel laughter haunted them, even as the physical manifestations of the haunting began to dissipate. For the Bell children, especially Betsy, the scars of those years would last a lifetime. John Bell's death left a mark not only on his family, but on the entire community. The story of the Bell Witch spread far beyond Adams, Tennessee, becoming a legend that would be passed down for generations. People from all over the country would hear the tale of the haunting, of the vengeful witch who had taken the life of a man without ever being seen. Though the entity seemed to have accomplished its goal, the question of why it had chosen John Bell and what truly fueled its hatred remained a mystery, one that would linger long after the haunting had ended. In the wake of John Bell's death, the Bell family hoped that the terror that had gripped their home for so many years might finally be over. The Bell Witch, after all, had achieved its dark purpose. It had taken John's life, just as it had promised, and for a while, it seemed that the entity might finally leave them in peace. The violent attacks on Betsy subsided, and the eerie disturbances that had plagued their home began to fade. But even though the immediate threat had diminished, the shadow of the Bell Witch still loomed over the family, the farm, and the entire community. In the months following John Bell's death, the once bustling Bell farmhouse became a place of deep sorrow and quiet reflection. The family tried to rebuild their lives, but the emotional scars left by the witch's torment were too deep to heal easily. Betsy, in particular, had suffered immensely. The physical attacks she had endured were gone, but the emotional trauma lingered. She had been haunted, manipulated, and terrorized by an unseen force that seemed to take joy in her pain. Now, though the witch's voice had gone silent, Betsy was left to grapple with the overwhelming fear and sadness that had become a part of her life. Despite the relative calm that followed John's death, the Bell family couldn't shake the feeling that the witch's presence still lingered, watching and waiting. They continued to hear faint, disembodied whispers from time to time, though the voice was not as aggressive as it once was. It was as if the entity was reminding them that it hadn't truly left, that it still had power over them. For the Bell family, life would never return to the way it had been before the haunting began. The peace they had once known was gone, replaced by the weight of the tragedy they had endured. As time passed, Betsy tried to move forward with her life. She had been engaged to a young man named Joshua Gardner before the haunting escalated, but the strain of the witch's attacks had put their relationship on hold. The entity had made it clear that it disapproved of their union, taunting Betsy about her engagement, and even going so far as to threaten Joshua's life. Betsy had been forced to break off the engagement, fearing that the witch's wrath would bring more suffering to those she loved. Even after John Bell's death, Betsy remained hesitant to reconnect with Joshua. She had no way of knowing whether the witch would return if she reignited the relationship. The fear of bringing the entity back into her life was too great, and so she made the difficult decision to move on. Betsy eventually married another man, Richard Powell, a local school teacher who had been a long-time family friend. Though Powell was much older than Betsy, their marriage brought her some measure of stability, and together they left Adams, Tennessee, to start a new life away from the farm that had become a place of nightmares. For the rest of the Bell family, life continued quietly on the farm. Though the Bell Witch's direct attacks had ceased, the farm remained a source of fascination and fear for the local community. Neighbors and visitors would often talk about the haunting in hushed tones, wondering if the witch might one day return. The legend of the Bell Witch grew, spreading far beyond the small Tennessee town. People from neighboring states came to visit the farm, hoping to catch a glimpse of the paranormal activity that had once terrorized the Bell family. As the years went by, the story of the Bell Witch took on a life of its own. The tale of the vengeful entity that had tormented the Bell family and claimed the life of John Bell became a piece of local folklore, passed down from generation to generation. It was whispered around campfires, told in taverns, and shared among friends. Each retelling seemed to grow more fantastical, adding new details and layers to the story. Some claimed the witch was the spirit of a wronged woman. Others believed it was a demon sent to punish John Bell for some unknown sin. The true origin of the Bell Witch remained a mystery, one that no amount of speculation could solve. Despite the enduring fear surrounding the legend, the Bell family's descendants were able to live relatively peaceful lives after the events. Betsy and her husband lived out the rest of their days away from Adams, and though they could never fully escape the memory of the haunting, they managed to build a life free from the witch's influence. The Bell farm remained in the family for generations, though none who lived there ever experienced the same level of terror that John and Betsy had. However, the Bell Witch wasn't entirely gone. Several years after John Bell's death, the entity reportedly returned to the farm for a brief period. It made its presence known by speaking to members of the Bell family, though its tone was far less menacing than it had been during its original reign of terror. It seemed almost playful this time, offering cryptic messages and making predictions about the future. The witch claimed it would return again one day, though it gave no clear indication of when or why. After a short time, the voice disappeared once more, leaving the family in a state of unease. True to its word, the Bell Witch never fully faded from memory. Even though the farm grew quiet again and no further violent hauntings occurred, the legacy of the witch remained firmly entrenched in the town's history. Locals continued to speak of the Bell Witch in reverent tones, warning their children not to venture too close to the old Bell property after dark, for fear that the spirit might still be lingering, waiting for another chance to wreak havoc. The legend of the Bell Witch has endured for nearly 2 centuries, captivating the imagination of those who hear it. Skeptics have tried to explain away the events as superstition or mass hysteria, while believers hold fast to the notion that something truly supernatural took place on the Bell farm. The story has inspired countless books, articles, and even films, solidifying its place as one of America's most famous hauntings. To this day, visitors still come to Adams, Tennessee, hoping to catch a glimpse of the Bell Witch or to feel the lingering energy of the entity that once terrorized a family and captivated a nation. Whether they are true believers or merely curious thrill seekers, they all leave with a sense of unease, as if the witch's spirit still lingers in the shadows, watching, waiting for the right moment to return. For the Bell family, the memory of those years will never fade. The death of John Bell, the torment of Betsy, and the voice that haunted their every waking moment left a mark that time could never fully erase. Though the witch's physical presence may have waned, its legacy lives on, a chilling reminder of the power of the unknown and the horrors that sometimes lie just beyond the veil of the ordinary. Anneliese Michel grew up in a small Bavarian village in post-war Germany, surrounded by the strong influence of the Catholic Church. From an early age, her life revolved around prayer, religious education, and a deep sense of devotion. Her parents, devout Catholics, believed that faith was the foundation of a moral life, and Anneliese embraced their teachings wholeheartedly. However, beneath the surface of this pious upbringing was a persistent pressure to achieve spiritual perfection, a burden she would carry throughout her short life. By the time she reached her teenage years, Anneliese felt an overwhelming sense of duty to live righteously. She avoided anything that might be considered sinful and constantly worried that her thoughts or actions might offend God. This need to be good was not just about faith. It became a source of intense anxiety. The line between religious devotion and fear of divine punishment grew thinner with each passing day. She confessed her sins frequently, sometimes obsessing over minor mistakes, such as missing a prayer or feeling envy toward a friend. To her, these slip-ups felt like betrayals, not just to God, but to herself. Her struggles with self-worth deepened when, at the age of 16, she experienced her first medical episode. During school, she suddenly lost control of her body, collapsing in a fit of convulsions. Confused and frightened, Anneliese woke up in the hospital, where doctors diagnosed her with temporal lobe epilepsy, a neurological disorder known to cause seizures, memory lapses, and hallucinations. Although the doctors assured her that medication would manage her symptoms, Anneliese sensed that her suffering had a deeper meaning. Why, she wondered, was she being afflicted this way? Had she somehow failed God? Despite taking prescribed anti-seizure medication, her symptoms persisted. Anneliese began to experience terrifying visual disturbances, shadowy figures that would appear in her bedroom, whispering cruel words she couldn't ignore. Sometimes, these hallucinations made her question if the people around her were really there. These experiences were deeply unsettling, leaving her exhausted and anxious. She isolated herself, withdrawing from social activities, fearful of judgment and embarrassment. Her parents, initially hopeful that treatment would improve her condition, grew increasingly concerned. Her inner turmoil also led to unsettling behaviors. At first, she simply punished herself for perceived failings, praying for hours without rest, or kneeling on hard surfaces until her knees were bruised. However, as her mental state deteriorated, these behaviors grew more extreme. She would wake up in the middle of the night and intentionally sleep on the cold floor, believing it was a form of penance. Other times, she deprived herself of basic comforts, like food and warmth, convinced that she needed to suffer to purify her soul. As the seizures and hallucinations continued, Anneliese's sense of identity became increasingly fragmented. She began questioning if she was cursed or if an evil presence had taken root within her. The medical explanations offered little comfort. How could something as clinical as a brain disorder account for the overwhelming darkness that haunted her mind? To Anneliese, her suffering felt like a spiritual battle, a test from God that she had to endure no matter the cost. As Anneliese entered adulthood, her mental and physical state deteriorated rapidly. The seizures became more frequent, and no combination of medications seemed to control them. But what disturbed her most were the terrifying visions and voices that invaded her mind. These were not just hallucinations. She believed they carried a message, one that filled her with fear. At first, it was the faint sound of whispers, but soon they grew louder and more hostile. The voices accused her of being unworthy, insisting she was beyond redemption. They told her she had failed, that her soul was lost. The once devout girl, who had cherished her faith, began to experience deep confusion. Praying, which had once given her comfort, now seemed impossible. The voices mocked her when she tried, telling her that God no longer listened. She avoided church, even tearing up prayer cards and damaging crucifixes in frustration. It was as if everything sacred that had once anchored her life now felt distant and unreachable. Her behavior became increasingly erratic. In moments of panic, she would lash out, not knowing how to cope with the overpowering emotions inside her. She withdrew from her family, spending long hours alone in her room, unable to find peace. Sometimes she would pace back and forth or sit for hours in silence, lost in the storm of thoughts that never seemed to quiet. What frightened her most was the sense that she no longer had control over herself. Her family tried their best to help, but the changes in Annalise were overwhelming. She refused to eat regular meals, not because of a lack of hunger, but because she believed that depriving herself was the only way to cleanse her spirit. The voices told her that she did not deserve comfort or nourishment. She began to experience strange impulses, behaviors she couldn't explain but felt compelled to follow. She might suddenly throw herself to the ground, feeling as though her body was not her own to command. Night after night, her sleep was interrupted by vivid nightmares of grotesque creatures and apocalyptic visions. Some nights she awoke in tears, convinced that her prayers had damned her instead of saved her. Other times she felt a compulsion to make herself physically uncomfortable, lying on the cold floor despite the warmth of her bed, or kneeling for hours until her legs trembled. These acts were not intended to harm, but felt like punishment she deserved. She hoped that, through suffering, she could find forgiveness for whatever unseen sin haunted her. The hallucinations worsened over time. Sometimes she saw figures she described as demons' twisted shapes with burning eyes lurking in the corners of her vision. She would scream and cry out to her parents, terrified by what she believed were real entities surrounding her. Her mother would try to comfort her, but nothing seemed to ease the fear. Even when the apparitions disappeared, their presence lingered in Annelise's mind. She believed these beings wanted to destroy her from within, and no amount of medical treatment could stop them. Doctors urged the family to remain patient, insisting that her symptoms were caused by her epilepsy and possibly a developing mental illness. Yet the Michel family was losing hope. Every new medication seemed to come with side effects that worsened Annelise's suffering exhaustion, mood swings, and feelings of despair. They began to suspect that what tormented their daughter went beyond science's understanding. Meanwhile, Annalise herself grew more convinced that her affliction was not a medical problem, but a spiritual one. She told her parents that the medications were useless because she was not sick in the way the doctors thought. Something evil, she believed, had taken root inside her, and only faith could drive it out. She spoke of hearing names in her mind, figures she identified as Judas, Nero, and others condemned in Christian tradition. These presences taunted her, making her believe she was trapped in a battle for her soul. By the time Annelise's condition reached its breaking point, the Michel family had exhausted every medical option available to them. Each visit to a neurologist or psychiatrist ended with a prescription for new medications, anticonvulsants, antipsychotics, but nothing relieved Annelise's torment. As weeks turned into months, her parents began to believe that something far beyond medicine was plaguing their daughter. They were devout Catholics, and it became increasingly difficult for them to ignore the possibility that Annelise's suffering was spiritual, not merely medical. Annalise, too, had abandoned hope in medical explanations. She insisted that what controlled her wasn't a disease, but a dark force. Her strange behavior and outbursts now carried a sinister weight. She claimed that malevolent beings inhabited her, whispering blasphemies and urging her to reject everything good in her life. The voices were relentless, taunting her and telling her she was destined for ruin. At times, she felt she couldn't even pray because the words became twisted in her mouth, as if the darkness within her was interfering. Her family sought the advice of local priests, hoping that the church could offer the help that doctors could not. However, the priests were cautious. Official exorcisms were rare, and required proof that the afflicted person's condition could not be explained by illness alone. The priest advised the Michels to continue with medical treatment, but Annelie's worsening state left them feeling helpless. Each passing day revealed new signs of her struggle. She would refuse meals for extended periods, explaining that it was part of a personal penance, or spend hours staring at religious objects, visibly distressed as if in conflict with herself. Despite these alarming signs, most of the clergy remained hesitant. However, Father Ernst Alt, a local priest, became deeply concerned about Annelie's condition. He believed her suffering was unlike anything he had encountered before. After meeting with Anneliese, he noted the strange shifts in her personality moments where she seemed possessed by an overwhelming rage, only to collapse moments later, apologizing and sobbing uncontrollably. Father Alt, but these episodes were more than medical symptoms. He suspected that something spiritual was taking hold of her. The priest's belief was further cemented by Annelie's growing resistance to sacred items. On several occasions, she recoiled from crucifixes as if in pain and was unable to enter chapels, insisting that an unseen force was blocking her. Father Alt urged the family to pursue an exorcism, believing that it was the only way to save her. He explained that exorcisms were not quick fixes. They were difficult rituals that required time, endurance, and faith from everyone involved. But if her condition truly stemmed from a spiritual affliction, the ritual was their only option. To perform the rite, however, they needed formal permission from the diocese. Father Alt, along with another priest, Father Arnold Renz, documented Annelie's worsening symptoms and sent a request to Bishop Joseph Stangl. After reviewing the case, the bishop granted approval for the ritual Romanum, the official rite of exorcism. The priests were instructed to follow strict guidelines, ensuring the ritual was performed with care and precision. Anneliese welcomed the news of the exorcism. By this point, she was utterly convinced that she was being consumed by something evil, and she saw the ritual as her only hope for salvation. She told her parents that the demons inside her claimed they would never let her go, but she believed that through suffering, she could defeat them. Anneliese began to view her suffering not just as punishment, but as a form of sacrifice. She believed that her trials could help cleanse others, perhaps even atone for the sins of strangers she had never met. Her family was equally desperate for a solution, no matter how difficult it might be. They believed that the exorcism would be a path to healing, though none of them could have predicted the toll it would take. Annelie's condition had already pushed them to the edge emotionally, spiritually, and physically. Yet, the promise of deliverance gave them a glimmer of hope that perhaps, at long last, their daughter could be freed from the torment that had consumed her life. But with that hope came fear. They knew the ritual would be grueling, and they worried about what it would do to Annelie's fragile body. The priest warned them that the exorcism might provoke violent episodes and that there were no guarantees of success. But for the Michels, this was their final option. Medical treatments had failed, and time was slipping away. All they could do now was trust in the power of their faith and in Annelie's belief that salvation was worth any price. In the fall of 1975, the first exorcism session began inside the Michel family's modest home. The room, dimly lit by candles and filled with religious artifacts, carried the quiet heaviness of fear and hope. Father Arnold Renz and Father Ernst Alt led the ceremony, reciting prayers from the ritual Romanum, the ancient text used to expel evil spirits. The atmosphere was tense, every word of the prayer heavy with expectation. Anneliese sat in the middle of the room, her hands trembling in her lap, waiting for the first confrontation with whatever force held her captive. From the very beginning, the sessions were harrowing. As the priest prayed over her, Annelie's demeanor shifted rapidly. At times, she appeared peaceful, mouthing along with familiar prayers. But soon after, her voice would change, becoming low, hoarse, and full of malice. She would thrash violently in her chair, growling and shouting words she claimed weren't her own. It was as though multiple personalities had taken control, each one angry and defiant. She identified these voices as belonging to notorious figures like Judas and even darker beings, insisting that they lived within her and refused to leave. The exorcisms were physically and emotionally draining, not only for Annalise, but for everyone involved. The priests and her parents often had to restrain her when she would throw herself onto the floor or bang her head against walls, driven by impulses she couldn't explain. Despite their efforts, Annalise's physical condition began to deteriorate. Her body, already fragile from the months of self-denial, grew weaker with each passing session. She was unable to keep down food, convinced by the voices that she must reject earthly nourishment to complete her mission. The priest tried to encourage her to eat, but Annalise refused, believing that her suffering was necessary for salvation. Each exorcism session lasted for hours, sometimes stretching late into the night. Her parents were horrified by what they witnessed. Annalise's voice shifting into guttural tones that didn't sound human, her body convulsing uncontrollably, and her skin breaking out in unexplained marks and bruises. Yet there were brief moments of lucidity, when she would beg her family to continue the ritual, insisting that she could feel the darkness being forced to the surface. Her parents clung to these moments, believing that Annalise's suffering was bringing her closer to freedom. They prayed alongside the priests, sometimes holding her hands as she trembled, and whispered that she could feel herself slipping away. To them, each session, no matter how excruciating, was a step closer to reclaiming their daughter from the grip of evil. Over the course of 10 months, more than 60 exorcism sessions were performed. Annalise's condition worsened with each one. She rarely slept, her nights filled with haunting visions that left her gasping for breath. During the day, she would pace the house or sit silently, lost in her thoughts, her once bright personality reduced to a shadow of its former self. As the rituals dragged on, the demons seemed to resist with greater intensity. Annalise would scream for hours, her voice cracking from exhaustion. She would mock the priests, taunting them with obscene language, daring them to continue. The priests remained resolute, believing that the intensity of her resistance was a sign that the exorcism was working. They prayed louder, reciting the sacred words over and over, hoping to wear down whatever force held her captive. The toll on Annalise's body was undeniable. She became severely underweight, her limbs weak and trembling from exhaustion. Her knees were swollen and bruised from hours spent kneeling in prayer, her voice hoarse from constant screaming. Yet she refused to stop. She believed that her suffering was part of a larger plan, that by enduring these trials, she was helping to save others from spiritual harm. To Annalise, this was no longer just about her freedom. It was a sacrifice for a higher purpose. Despite her family's pleas for rest, Annalise insisted on continuing the exorcisms. She begged her parents not to abandon the ritual, even though they could see her body was slowly giving out. Her mother often cried during the sessions, watching helplessly as her daughter endured what seemed like unbearable pain. But Annalise would always reassure her, saying that it would all be over soon, that she would be free, even if it meant surrendering everything she had left. The priests, too, struggled with the emotional weight of the situation. Father Renz and Father Out spent countless hours in prayer, asking for strength to continue. They knew that Annalise's condition was worsening, but they believed that abandoning the ritual would be tantamount to giving in to the forces they were fighting. The line between faith and desperation blurred, and the priests pressed forward, hoping that each session would finally bring the deliverance they sought. Toward the end of the exorcisms, Annalise's moments of clarity became fewer and far between. Her speech slowed, her movements were weak and uncoordinated, and her eyes, once bright with determination, grew distant. Yet she never expressed regret for what she had endured. In her rare, lucid moments, she whispered to her parents and the priests that she was ready for the end, whatever that might mean. By June 1976, Annalise Michel's body was ravaged from months of relentless exorcisms and physical exhaustion. Her frame was skeletal, her movements slow and unsteady. Yet, despite her weakened state, she clung to a fierce belief that the torment she endured had a higher purpose. Every breath she took felt like a battle, but Annalise was certain that she was on the verge of liberation, that through suffering, she could achieve a form of spiritual victory. Her parents were filled with both hope and dread. They wanted to believe that the end was near, that their daughter would finally be free from the torment that had consumed her for years. But they also saw the toll it had taken. Annalise could no longer walk without assistance, and speaking was a struggle. Still, whenever she had moments of lucidity, she insisted that the exorcisms continue. "I have to keep going," she whispered to her mother one night, her voice barely audible. "I'm almost there." The exorcism sessions became increasingly urgent as the priests and her family sensed that they were running out of time. During one of the final rituals, Annalise's body convulsed violently, her face twisted in pain. Yet, between these intense moments, she would sometimes flash a strange, serene smile, telling those around her that she could feel the darkness weakening. It was as if she believed that each moment of agony brought her closer to a divine release. On June 30th, 1976, the final exorcism session took place. Annalise was too weak to kneel, so she lay on a mattress placed on the floor. Her parents, desperate and exhausted, held her hands, hoping against hope that this would be the moment of deliverance. Father Renz and Father Alt recited the exorcism prayers with steady determination, their voices filling the room with sacred verses. Annalise's breathing was shallow, but she forced herself to respond to the prayers, whispering "yes" and "please stay with me" whenever she had the strength. Throughout the session, Annalise's expressions alternated between anguish and moments of strange peace. At one point, she looked into her mother's eyes and murmured, "Mother, I'm afraid." Her mother stroked her hair, fighting back tears, assuring Annalise that she was not alone. They all prayed that this would be the final battle, that the forces tormenting her would release their grip at last. Toward the end of the ritual, Annalise's voice softened, and she said something that haunted those present for years to come. "Please, don't give up on me." But as the hours dragged on, her strength gave out. The session ended without the sense of triumph they had hoped for, and Annalise, too weak to speak, closed her eyes and drifted into a restless sleep. The following morning, on July 1st, 1976, Annalise Michel passed away quietly in her home. Her parents discovered her lifeless body and, in their grief, called the priests to inform them of her passing. Annalise's frail frame, reduced to just over 60 pounds, was a tragic testament to the suffering she had endured. For her family and the priests, the overwhelming question was whether her death was a spiritual victory or an unbearable loss. The tragedy did not end with Annalise's passing. In the months that followed, the case drew public attention, leading to an investigation that scrutinized the actions of her parents and the priests. Authorities questioned whether Annalise's death could have been prevented had medical intervention been prioritized over religious rituals. Her parents and the priests were charged with negligent homicide, sparking a controversial trial that captivated the nation and raised difficult questions about the intersection of faith and mental health. During the trial, Annalise's parents defended their decision, insisting that they had followed their daughter's wishes and had acted out of love and desperation. They described Annalise as a willing participant in the exorcisms, someone who truly believed that her suffering had meaning. The priests, too, stood by their actions, explaining that they had exhausted every other option and that Annalise herself had pleaded for the rituals to continue. Medical experts testified that Annelise's condition was likely the result of untreated epilepsy and psychosis, worsened by the extreme stress of the exorcisms. But for those closest to Annelise, the answer was more complicated. They believed that Annelise's suffering could not be fully explained by medical terms, that something deeper had taken place, something beyond human understanding. In the end, the priests and Annelise's parents were found guilty of negligent homicide, but received suspended sentences, as the court acknowledged that they had acted out of a misguided sense of care and faith. The verdict left many unresolved questions. Was Annelise a victim of untreated illness, or did she truly endure a spiritual trial? And if her suffering was real, did it accomplish the redemption she had hoped for? Annelise's story remains both a cautionary tale and a source of reflection on the complexities of faith, mental health, and the human need for meaning. To this day, some view her as a tragic figure who was failed by the systems meant to help her, while others believe that she experienced a spiritual battle that few can understand. In the years following her death, her grave became a place of pilgrimage for those who believed in the possibility of miracles. Visitors left flowers, prayers, and messages, hoping that, in some way, Annelise's suffering had opened a path to healing. But for her family and the priests who had stood by her, the story was one of profound loss, a reminder that sometimes the search for salvation can lead to unimaginable sacrifice. In the late 1930s, as the world teetered on the brink of war, the quiet English countryside in Suffolk held secrets long buried beneath the earth. The land, rolling in green, had a gentle way of keeping its past concealed. But for Edith Pretty, the owner of Sutton Hoo Estate, the ancient burial mounds on her property stirred her curiosity. Edith was a wealthy widow in her 50s, and despite her age, she possessed an adventurous spirit. She had always been fascinated by history and archaeology. After years of living on the estate and gazing at the mounds, she began to wonder what lay beneath them. Her interest grew after hearing local legends that these mounds might hide long-lost treasures, perhaps even the resting place of kings. It was the summer of 1938 when Edith finally decided to act. She had been reading articles on recent archaeological digs and, inspired, she contacted the local Ipswich Museum for advice. They recommended Basil Brown, a self-taught archaeologist with a passion for unearthing history. Though not formally trained, Brown had a deep knowledge of the land and a reputation for careful, thorough work. Edith invited him to the estate, and soon an agreement was made to begin exploring the mysterious mounds. Basil Brown was not a man of wealth or high education, but he possessed a talent that few others did a sense of the land. He had an ability to read the earth and understand its secrets. When he first set foot on Sutton Hoo, he was struck by the sheer size of the mounds. Some were as tall as trees, looming over the landscape like sentinels guarding something precious. The excavation began in earnest, but no one could have imagined what they were about to uncover. The first few days were slow. Basil and his small team of laborers worked carefully, mindful not to damage anything. They had no idea what lay beneath, whether it would be an empty mound or something extraordinary. At first, the dig revealed little more than small fragments of iron and decayed wood, signs that the mound had been disturbed before. Yet Basil remained optimistic. He knew that patience was key. As the team continued to remove layers of earth, something remarkable began to take shape, the outline of a ship. Brown could hardly believe his eyes. The sandy soil had preserved an impression of a ship, large enough to befit royalty. The wood had long since decayed, leaving only a ghostly imprint, but the form of the ship was unmistakable. It stretched nearly 90 feet long, a size that suggested this was no ordinary burial. This was something far grander. Word of the discovery spread quickly. Edith Pretty herself came to the site daily, watching with excitement as the ancient vessel emerged from the soil. She had hoped for something significant, but the magnitude of what was being uncovered exceeded her wildest dreams. The ship's structure, though fragile and partially destroyed by time, was evidence of a culture that had mastery over the sea. But it wasn't just the size of the ship that astonished the team. As they dug deeper, they realized that the vessel had been used as a burial ship, likely for someone of great importance. The thought lingered. Could this be the resting place of a long-forgotten king? Excitement turned to trepidation as the team carefully uncovered more of the ship. The scale of the task ahead became clearer. This was not a simple dig. It was a mission to recover a piece of history so old that its very existence had been forgotten. Every move had to be precise, every piece of earth removed with care. Basil Brown knew the significance of what they had found, but he also understood the risks. An excavation of this scale had never been attempted before in England, at least not with such a delicate site. The ship was a marvel, but it was fragile. Any mistake could destroy what little remained. As more of the ship was revealed, it became clear that this was not an isolated find. The ship was part of a much larger burial complex, perhaps one used by an elite group of people warriors, leaders, and rulers. The ship had been placed in the earth with great care, loaded with treasures meant to accompany its occupant into the afterlife. By the end of the summer, the excavation had gained attention beyond Suffolk. Archaeologists from across Britain began to take notice. The press, too, caught wind of the discovery. Headlines soon spoke of Britain's greatest find, and speculation ran wild about the identity of the person buried within the ship. Some believed it could be a legendary king or warrior, a figure whose story had been lost to time. Despite the growing attention, Edith Pretty remained modest about her role in the discovery. She had simply acted on a hunch, following her curiosity. But as the ship continued to reveal its secrets, it became clear that her decision to explore the mounds was one that would reshape the understanding of England's ancient history. The discovery of the ship set the stage for a much larger adventure one that would continue to unfold in the months and years to come. For now, though, the ship lay beneath the soil, waiting for its full story to be told. As the sun rose over the fields of Suffolk in the summer of 1939, a small team of workers arrived at Suttonhoo, eager to continue their excavation of what was shaping up to be one of the most remarkable finds in British history. Basil Brown, the archaeologist leading the dig, had uncovered the outline of an ancient ship. But what lay beneath was still a mystery. The real work was only just beginning. The excavation site, now buzzing with activity, was far from a glamorous operation. With no heavy machinery and only simple tools like shovels, trowels, and brushes, the work was slow, meticulous, and physically demanding. Each layer of soil had to be removed carefully to avoid disturbing any fragile artifacts that might lie beneath the surface. Time was not on their side, as the threat of war loomed over Europe, adding urgency to their efforts. Brown's small team of workers, mostly local laborers, had little formal training in archaeology, but they followed his instructions diligently. He had a deep respect for the past, and he knew that any mistake, no matter how small, could erase vital clues to understanding the burial. The ship they had uncovered was not made of iron or stone. It had once been a grand wooden vessel. Over the centuries, the wood had decayed, leaving only the impression of the ship in the soil. This meant that the entire outline of the ship was incredibly delicate, requiring precision to uncover it without causing damage. As they dug deeper, the true size of the ship became more apparent. Nearly 90 feet long, it was the kind of ship that could only have belonged to someone of great importance. It wasn't just its size that amazed the team. It was the craftsmanship. The lines of the ship's hull were graceful, curving elegantly through the earth, a testament to the shipbuilders who had constructed it more than 1,000 years earlier. Brown's excitement grew as the excavation progressed, but so did his sense of responsibility. The discovery of the ship was already monumental, but he knew there had to be more. Anglo-Saxon burial customs suggested that whoever was buried here had been laid to rest with treasures fit for a king. The ship, it seemed, was just the beginning. As the days passed, the team began to uncover a wealth of small finds, pieces of iron, fragments of pottery, and even a few rusted nails that hinted at the ship's construction. These items were important, but they were not the treasures the team had hoped to find. Still, Basil remained patient. He knew that the most valuable artifacts were likely still hidden deeper within the burial chamber, and he was determined to reach them. The dig became more challenging as they approached the center of the ship, where the burial chamber was believed to be. The earth here was heavier, and the signs of earlier disturbances, likely grave robbers from centuries past, became more evident. Some parts of the ship had been damaged, either by the passage of time or by human hands, but there were still large sections of the vessel that remained untouched. One day, as the team carefully removed soil from the center of the ship, they uncovered something extraordinary: a large wooden structure that had once formed the burial chamber. Though the wood itself had long since decayed, the impression it left behind was unmistakable. The chamber was large enough to hold not only a body, but also the treasures that would have accompanied it. Basil Brown was struck by the enormity of what they had found. This wasn't just a ship burial, it was a royal tomb. The chamber was situated in the very heart of the ship, a place of honor reserved for someone of the highest status. Though the chamber had been damaged over the centuries, there were still signs that it had once held magnificent items. The team worked slowly, methodically, removing the earth surrounding the chamber. As they did, they began to find objects that hinted at the grandeur of the burial. The first signs were small metal fragments, delicate pieces of jewelry, and the remnants of finely crafted items that had once adorned the body. These objects, though decayed, were exquisite in their design, suggesting that the person buried here had been incredibly wealthy, perhaps even a king. But the true treasures of the burial had not yet been uncovered. Brown knew that the most significant finds were still hidden beneath layers of soil. The team worked tirelessly, day after day, uncovering more and more of the burial chamber. The anticipation was palpable. Every piece of earth they removed brought them closer to the moment of revelation. As the excavation continued, word of the discovery spread even further. Archaeologists from across the country began to take notice, and some even traveled to Sutton Hoo to witness the dig for themselves. It was becoming clear that this was no ordinary excavation. What they had uncovered was one of the greatest archaeological finds in British history, and it was only a matter of time before the world would know the full extent of the discovery. Despite the growing attention, Basil Brown remained focused on the task at hand. The pressure was immense, but he knew that they were on the verge of something incredible. The burial chamber was nearly fully exposed, and soon they would uncover the treasures that had been hidden for centuries. As the final layers of earth were removed from the chamber, the team began to realize just how grand the burial truly was. They found evidence of finely wrought metalwork, including gold and silver items that had once adorned the person buried within. Though many of the treasures had been damaged or lost to time, what remained was enough to suggest that this was the burial of someone truly significant. The discovery of the burial chamber was a turning point in the excavation. What had begun as a simple curiosity had become a full-scale archaeological dig, one that would change the understanding of early medieval England. For Basil Brown and his team, the discovery of the ship and the chamber was just the beginning of a much larger story, one that would unfold in the months and years to come. The discovery of the burial chamber at Sutton Hoo marked a turning point in the excavation. The ship had been a stunning find, but the treasures hidden within the chamber were what truly revealed the significance of this ancient burial. As Basil Brown and his team carefully removed the last layers of soil, They began to uncover a collection of artifacts that hinted at the immense wealth and status of the person entombed within. The burial chamber, located at the heart of the ship, had likely once contained a wooden coffin, though all traces of the wood had long since decayed. What remained, however, was a dazzling array of items that had been placed alongside the body items that spoke of a life of power, influence, and high social standing. This was no ordinary grave. This was the final resting place of someone of immense importance, perhaps even a king. One of the first objects to emerge from the soil was a magnificent helmet. Though damaged by time and the elements, it was clear that this was no simple piece of armor. The helmet was adorned with intricate designs, including representations of fierce animals and warriors, all crafted in exquisite detail. It had once been worn by a figure of great significance, someone who likely commanded both respect and fear. The helmet, with its mask-like faceplate and iron cheek pieces, gave the impression of a powerful warrior king. Its craftsmanship suggested that the person buried here had connections to distant lands, perhaps Scandinavia, where similar helmets had been found. As the team continued to excavate, they uncovered more treasures. A finely wrought sword was found next, its hilt inlaid with gold and garnets. The sword was a symbol of power, not just a weapon, but a representation of the authority of the one who had wielded it. Alongside the sword were other items associated with warfare, including a large shield and a collection of spears. These were the tools of a leader, someone who had commanded armies and fought in battles. The items painted a picture of a man who had been both a ruler and a warrior, a figure whose life had been shaped by conflict and conquest. Yet the burial chamber also contained objects of great beauty, items that suggested the person buried here had enjoyed a life of luxury and refinement. Gold buckles, intricately crafted jewelry, and a collection of silverware were found, each piece more ornate than the last. Some of the items had been imported from far-off lands, including silver bowls and spoons from the Byzantine Empire, evidence of trade and cultural connections that spanned continents. These items showed that the person buried here had lived in a time when England was not an isolated island, but part of a wider world, a world connected by trade routes and diplomacy. Perhaps the most striking find was a large, elaborately decorated belt buckle made of solid gold. Weighing over a pound, the buckle was a masterpiece of craftsmanship, featuring interwoven patterns that symbolized strength and unity. Its size and weight suggested that it had been worn by someone of great stature, both physically and socially. The buckle, along with the other treasures, spoke of immense wealth, the kind of wealth that only the most powerful in society could accumulate. As the team cataloged the items found in the burial chamber, it became increasingly clear that this was not just a burial, it was a statement. The person buried here had wanted to be remembered, to leave a lasting legacy. The ship, the treasures, and the sheer scale of the burial all suggested that this had been a leader of extraordinary influence, someone who had shaped the course of history in their time. But who was this person? That question lingered over the excavation like a shadow. No body had been found in the burial chamber. Centuries of decay had left little more than traces of organic matter where the body once lay. Still, archaeologists were able to piece together clues from the artifacts and the burial itself. The size of the ship and the opulence of the treasures suggested that this was the grave of an Anglo-Saxon king, perhaps even Redwald, the ruler of East Anglia in the early 7th century. Redwald was a powerful figure in Anglo-Saxon England. According to historical records, he had been a strong leader who wielded significant influence over other kings in the region. He had converted to Christianity, but also maintained traditional pagan beliefs, a fact reflected in the mix of Christian and pagan symbols found in the burial chamber. If this was indeed the grave of Redwald, it would confirm his status as one of the most important figures of the Anglo-Saxon period. The burial also revealed much about the society in which this leader had lived. The treasures found in the chamber were not just symbols of personal wealth. They were representations of the interconnectedness of early medieval Europe. The silver from Byzantium, the garnets from India, and the craftsmanship influenced by Scandinavian designs all pointed to a world in which goods, ideas, and cultures flowed across borders. But while the items found in the burial chamber were awe-inspiring, they also raised questions. What had caused this king to be buried in such a grand manner? Had his death been the result of natural causes, or had he fallen in battle? Had this burial been a display of his people's devotion, or was it meant to send a message to those who came after him? The ship, laden with treasures, seemed to speak of a desire to carry these symbols of power into the afterlife, a belief that even in death, this leader would continue to hold sway over the world. As the excavation came to an end, the team knew they had uncovered something truly extraordinary. The burial chamber at Sutton Hoo had revealed treasures that had been hidden for more than 1,000 years. Treasures that told the story of a long-forgotten king and the world in which he had lived. For Basil Brown and his team, it was the culmination of months of hard work and dedication. But for the wider world, it was just the beginning of a new understanding of England's past. The treasures of Sutton Hoo would soon be displayed in museums, where people from all over the world could come and marvel at the craftsmanship and beauty of these ancient artifacts. Yet, even as they were cleaned and preserved, they would remain tied to the mystery of the person who had been buried in that ship, a figure whose identity might never be known for certain, but whose legacy would live on through the objects he left behind. The burial chamber had been unearthed, but its secrets would continue to captivate the imaginations of historians, archaeologists, and the public for generations to come. The excavation at Sutton Hoo had revealed extraordinary treasures, but it was the discovery's ripple effect that truly began to reshape the understanding of England's ancient past. As word of the find spread across Britain, the magnitude of what had been uncovered became clear, not just to archaeologists, but to the general public, scholars, and even political figures. The Sutton Hoo ship burial was quickly recognized as one of the most important archaeological finds in British history, a window into a time that had long been shrouded in mystery. In the summer of 1939, just as the treasures from Sutton Hoo were being carefully excavated, the world was on the brink of conflict. The tensions leading to the outbreak of World War II were mounting, and in many ways, the discovery at Sutton Hoo served as a reminder of Britain's deep history and resilience. As the nation prepared for the uncertainties of war, the treasures from this ancient burial offered a sense of pride and continuity, connecting modern Britons to their Anglo-Saxon ancestors. For Edith Pretty, the landowner whose curiosity had sparked the excavation, the discovery had an emotional impact. She had long suspected that the mounds on her estate hid something special, but even she couldn't have imagined the grandeur of what lay beneath. Edith, a reserved and thoughtful woman, had always been interested in history and archaeology, but the scale of the find at Sutton Hoo exceeded her wildest expectations. She visited the excavation site daily, quietly observing as Basil Brown and his team painstakingly unearthed each artifact. Though Edith had initiated the dig, she remained humble about her role, insisting that the discovery belonged to history. In the months following the excavation, Edith made a decision that would forever cement her place in the story of Sutton Hoo. Rather than keeping the treasures for herself or selling them, she donated the entire collection to the British Museum. It was an act of generosity that reflected her deep sense of responsibility to history and her desire for the treasures to be studied and preserved for future generations. The decision ensured that the artifacts would be accessible to the public and to scholars, who would spend decades analyzing the find and its implications. The British Museum, which had long been a repository for the world's greatest cultural artifacts, was quick to recognize the importance of the Sutton Hoo treasures. The items, including the famous helmet, the gold belt buckle, and the intricately crafted jewelry, were displayed prominently, attracting visitors from across the country and beyond. People flocked to see the artifacts, eager to catch a glimpse of the ancient past and to learn more about the mysterious figure who had been buried in such splendor. The public reaction to the Sutton Hoo discovery was overwhelming. Newspapers ran headlines about the buried treasure and the king in the ship, fueling speculation about the identity of the person entombed in the ship burial. Theories abounded, with some suggesting that the ship had belonged to a legendary warrior, while others believed it was the resting place of a great king. The fascination with the find extended beyond the borders of Britain, with international scholars and archaeologists expressing interest in studying the artifacts and the burial site. But while the treasures themselves were stunning, it was the broader implications of the discovery that truly excited the academic community. Before Sutton Hoo, the early medieval period in England, often referred to as the Dark Ages, was seen as a time of cultural stagnation, a period following the fall of the Roman Empire, when much of Europe was thought to have fallen into disarray. The Sutton Hoo find challenged this view, offering evidence of a sophisticated and cosmopolitan society that had existed in England in the 6th and 7th centuries. The discovery of objects from distant lands, including silverware from Byzantium and garnets from as far away as India, demonstrated that the Anglo-Saxon elite were part of a vast network of trade and cultural exchange. These connections extended across Europe and beyond, suggesting that early medieval England was far more interconnected with the wider world than previously thought. The items found in the burial chamber revealed a society that valued craftsmanship, artistry, and wealth, a far cry from the image of a dark and isolated age. For historians and archaeologists, the Sutton Hoo ship burial opened up new lines of inquiry. Who was the person buried in the ship, and what did his burial tell us about the society he lived in? The consensus began to form around the idea that the burial belonged to Redwold, the king of East Anglia, a powerful figure who had been instrumental in the politics of early medieval England. While no definitive proof existed to confirm Redwold's identity as the person buried in the ship, the evidence, both historical and archaeological, pointed strongly in that direction. As the academic community delved deeper into the meaning of the Sutton Hoo treasures, the site itself became a point of national pride. The discovery was seen as a testament to Britain's deep and rich history, a reminder that the country's roots extended far back into the early medieval period. This sense of pride was particularly potent in the context of the looming war. As Britain prepared for the possibility of conflict, the Sutton Hoo find served as a symbol of resilience and continuity, a reminder that the nation had weathered countless challenges throughout its long history. However, the outbreak of World War II in September 1939 brought new challenges to the preservation of the Sutton Hoo treasures. The artifacts, now housed in the British Museum, were packed away and moved to secure storage to protect them from potential bombing raids. It would be several years before they could be displayed again, but even in storage, the significance of the find continued to grow. In the years following the war, the treasures of Sutton Hoo were once again placed on display, drawing renewed interest from scholars and the public alike. The site itself became a place of pilgrimage for those interested in England's early medieval past. Archaeological work at Sutton Hoo continued, with new discoveries shedding further light on the burial and the culture that had created it. As time passed, the Sutton Hoo ship burial became more than just an archaeological discovery. It became a symbol of Britain's cultural heritage. The treasures found in the burial chamber were celebrated not just for their beauty, but for what they represented, a connection to the distant past, to a time when kings ruled the land and the seas, and when the Anglo-Saxon people laid the foundations for the England that would emerge in the centuries to come. The impact of Sutton Hoo extended beyond the academic world. It influenced popular culture, inspiring books, films, and even artwork. The treasures, with their intricate designs and mysterious origins, captured the imagination of people around the world. The Sutton Hoo helmet, in particular, became an iconic symbol of Anglo-Saxon England, its distinctive design appearing in countless representations of early medieval warriors. But more than anything, Sutton Hoo stood as a testament to the power of curiosity and perseverance. What had begun as a simple desire to explore a set of burial mounds on a quiet Suffolk estate had led to one of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history. The impact of that discovery would be felt for generations, reminding the world of the enduring legacy of the Anglo-Saxon people and the mysteries that still lay buried beneath the earth. The Sutton Hoo discovery forever altered the understanding of early medieval England. Long after the final artifact had been unearthed and the excavation had concluded, the mysteries of the ship burial continued to captivate historians, archaeologists, and the general public. The artifacts, now safely housed in the British Museum, were more than just relics. They were keys to unlocking a forgotten past, one that had been shrouded in mystery for centuries. As scholars continued to study the treasures, new insights into the life and times of the Anglo-Saxons emerged. The burial itself became a symbol of the sophisticated society that had existed in England during the early 7th century, a society far more complex and interconnected than previously believed. Sutton Hoo had given the world a glimpse into the life of a ruler who had commanded immense respect and wielded significant power, whether it was Redwold, as many believed, or another figure of equal prominence. Despite all that had been uncovered, questions still lingered. Chief among them was the identity of the person buried in the ship. While the evidence pointed strongly to Redwold, the lack of definitive proof left room for debate. Some scholars suggested alternative possibilities, including other kings or powerful nobles from the East Anglian kingdom. The absence of human remains, likely lost to the ravages of time and the acidic soil, meant that the mystery of the burial's occupant might never be fully resolved. Even without a clear identity, the significance of the burial was undeniable. The ship, the treasures, and the careful arrangement of the grave goods all pointed to someone of immense importance. This was a person whose life had been marked by power, prestige, and wealth, someone who had commanded loyalty and respect from those around them. The grandeur of the burial reflected the importance placed on status and honor in Anglo-Saxon society, where kings and nobles were celebrated both in life and in death. The mystery extended beyond the identity of the buried figure. The purpose of the ship burial itself raised questions. Why had such an elaborate ceremony been conducted, and what did it symbolize? Ship burials were rare in England, and the practice was more commonly associated with Scandinavian cultures. Some historians believe that the Sutton Hoo burial was a reflection of the complex cultural influences at play in early medieval England. The Anglo-Saxons, who had come to Britain as invaders, had absorbed elements of both Roman and Scandinavian traditions, creating a unique blend of customs and beliefs. The ship burial, with its mixture of Christian and pagan symbols, suggested that the person buried at Sutton Hoo had navigated a world in which old and new beliefs coexisted. Redwold, if he was indeed the person buried there, had been known for his dual faith embracing Christianity while still honoring traditional pagan practices. The burial reflected this tension, with the treasures revealing a world in which religious beliefs were evolving, but not yet settled. The items found in the burial chamber also offered clues about the broader world in which this person had lived. The silverware from Byzantium, the garnets from India, and the craftsmanship influenced by Scandinavian and Frankish designs all pointed to a world connected by trade and diplomacy. The Sutton Hoo burial was not just a testament to one person's power. It was a reflection of a global network of exchange, where goods and ideas flowed across borders. As the years passed, Sutton Hoo became a touchstone for those studying the early medieval period. Archaeologists continued to explore the site, conducting further excavations and uncovering additional evidence of the Anglo-Saxon people who had once inhabited the area. While no discoveries rivaled the grandeur of the original ship burial, each new find added to the growing picture of life in East Anglia during the early 7th century. The site itself was transformed into a place of historical importance. Sutton Hoo, once a quiet estate with little public attention, became a destination for visitors from around the world. People came to walk among the burial mounds, to imagine the grand ship that had once rested beneath the earth, and to learn about the Anglo-Saxon kings who had shaped England's early history. The National Trust, which took over the management of the site, worked to preserve the landscape and educate the public about the significance of the discovery. The Sutton Hoo ship burial also left a lasting mark on popular culture. The story of the excavation and the treasures it uncovered inspired books, documentaries, and films, all seeking to capture the drama and mystery of the find. The iconic image of the Sutton Hoo helmet, with its menacing faceplate and intricate designs, became a symbol of Anglo-Saxon England, appearing in countless depictions of early medieval warriors. The discovery continued to spark the imaginations of writers, artists, and filmmakers who were drawn to the idea of a long-lost king buried with his treasures, waiting to be rediscovered. Yet for all the attention Sutton Hoo received, the site remained, at its core, a place of deep historical and emotional significance. The ship burial was a reminder of the fragility of history, of how easily the past can be forgotten, buried beneath layers of earth, and how it can be uncovered only through persistence and curiosity. Basil Brown, the self-taught archaeologist who had first unearthed the ship, had never imagined the scope of what he would find. His dedication and careful work had revealed a treasure trove of history that might otherwise have remained hidden. In the decades following the excavation, Brown's role in the discovery was finally recognized. Though initially overshadowed by professional archaeologists who had later joined the dig, Brown's contributions were celebrated as those of a skilled and dedicated archaeologist. His careful methods and deep respect for the site had ensured that the treasures of Sutton Hoo were preserved for future generations. Today, he is remembered as the man who brought one of England's greatest archaeological discoveries to light. As the 21st century began, Sutton Hoo continued to capture the public's imagination. New technologies allowed archaeologists to explore the site in ways that had once been impossible, using ground-penetrating radar and other tools to search for hidden features beneath the earth. These advancements, while yielding fascinating insights, also underscored how much of the past still lay waiting to be discovered. The ship burial at Sutton Hoo was just one chapter in a much larger story, one that archaeologists and historians were still piecing together. For all the answers Sutton Hoo had provided, the site remained a place of wonder and speculation. Who had been buried there, and what had their life been like? What had driven their people to create such a magnificent burial? And what did it say about their beliefs, their values, and their place in the world? These questions, and many others, would likely remain unanswered, but that was part of the magic of Sutton Hoo. It was a place where history and mystery intertwined, where the past reached out to the present in ways both profound and elusive. The ship and its treasures had been buried for more than 1,000 years, hidden from the world, waiting for the right moment to be found. And now, as the story of Sutton Hoo continued to unfold, it was clear that the discovery had not only changed the way people understood the past, it had become part of the fabric of Britain's national identity, a reminder of the deep roots that connected the present to the distant, mysterious past.